Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to call this meeting of the Atlantic Menhaden Board back into session. This is a continuation of the meeting that began yesterday and is slated to continue through a good portion of today. Just a quick sense as to how we plan to proceed today. First, I just thought it might be helpful to provide a brief reset on the issues that remain before the board for final decision. That includes the specifications and the allocation issues and other issues other than reference points that are in Amendment 3. So Megan's going to quickly run through those just to make it clear as to what the suite of issues and options are that are before the board for final decision today. I'll then open the floor to questions. We really didn't get much into that yesterday, but any questions that any board member may have for Megan on any of the remaining issues. I think we covered specifications well yesterday, so I think we're past that in terms of questions, although I think Jason would be welcome, more than happy to answer any if there are questions on that. But once we get through that, which I don't anticipate should take much time, I'm going to open the floor to motions. And I'll just have a brief comment on that before I do so. But for right now, I'm just going to give the floor to Megan for just a brief rundown of the issues that remain before the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a reminder, there are 7 issues for the board to decide today. The first is the total allowable catch, which is basically the size of the pie that we will be dividing. And then next would be quota allocation, so how we're going to divide that pie. The third is quota transfers, so how is quota moved between the different jurisdictions. The fourth is quota rollovers, how can unused quota be rolled over to the next year. The fifth issue is incidental catch and small-scale fisheries, so how do we deal with bycatch landings or landings after a directed quota has been met. Sixth is the episodic events set aside. So do we want to set aside quota for episodic events in New England and how much? And then the 7th issue is the Chesapeake Bay reduction fishery cap. So is there going to be a cap on the reduction fishery in the bay, and what is that cap going to be?
Thank you, Megan. And just for the board's edification, all of those issues are laid out in full detail in the draft amendment, beginning at page 46 and running through page 72. That is the chunk of the document that we're essentially working through for the rest of today. Are there any questions for Megan on any of the issues pending before the board? Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan, regarding quota transfers, option B, the quota transfers permitted with accountability measures for overages, would a transfer that occurs before a quota closure occurs, that would not factor into the trigger, right? The 5% overage is just for transfers that would occur after a state closes a fishery. Is that correct?
Let me see if I'm understanding your question. So if a state exceeded its quota 2 years in a row, in that 3rd year, are you asking if, no, okay.
If a state received a transfer from another state prior to a quota closure, that would not count as a transfer in excess of the 5% that would factor into the trigger.
Correct, yeah, so that's part of their now quota, and they would have to exceed that by 5%, yeah.
Other questions? All right, it looks like we are ready to go. I would urge that it might make the most sense to deal initially with specifications and then take on the various allocation and other issues in the amendment. That said, I'm fully aware that there is interest in perhaps bundled motions. Any member of this board may make any motion that they wish to make, and it would be in order at least ostensibly. But I just wanted to offer that suggestion for what it's worth. It's just a suggestion to kind of try to keep things as straightforward as possible, but consider that for what it is, which is just a recommendation, not a decree by any means. So with that, the floor is open for motions on any of the issues left pending before the board. Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Staff has a motion regarding an opt-in provision that I would like the board to consider, and if you could pull it up. If I get a second, I'll be happy to give some further justification. So I would move that if a fixed minimum option is selected, the following conditions would govern the activity. At the start of each fishing year and no later than January 31st, states must declare if they want to participate in the fixed minimum program. States have the option to opt out of the program and decline their fixed minimum allocation, or maintain 10,000 pounds of bycatch purposes and decline the remainder of their quota. States also have the right to opt into the program and receive their full allocation. In declaring its intent to receive its fixed minimum quota, a state can also choose to receive all or part of this amount. If a jurisdiction declines its full allocation, it must specifically identify the amount requested. States which opt in must demonstrate that the state has the intent and the ability to commercially harvest some or all of its Menhaden quota for the directed or bycatch fishery. This can be demonstrated through the issuance of permits for applicable gear types or species, historic landings, or the abundance of Menhaden in state waters. Any quota that is not received by a state is redistributed to the other jurisdictions based on historical landings from the time period selected by the board in this amendment.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Richie White.
For the purpose of discussion.
Thank you. And Pat, to you for discussion on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know this motion is a little Dave Pierce style. I apologize for that, but there's a lot of moving parts. But according to the amendment, the jurisdictions have the right to participate in a fixed minimum program at their sole discretion. Under this option, the states are entitled to receive a fixed percentage of the TAC. However, states have the rights to decline the fixed minimum allocation. For the clarity purposes, I'm calling this an opt-out provision. A potential concern is that the amendment does not provide specifics on how the foregone quota is to be redistributed among the other states. In addition, there are no specifications that a state must meet to keep their quota. At the August board meeting, concerns were raised about this opt-in process, and a motion was made to consider an opt-in provision whereby a state would have to manually declare their intent to use a fixed minimum. The motion failed as the prevailing side convincingly argued that the board did not need to get into the details at that time. In addition, the board retained the right to craft these provisions during the final approval process. That specific point is reflected in the minutes of the meeting, and since we're about to vote on the fixed minimum provision, I think it is imperative for us all to have a similar understanding of the conditions, and the conditions under which we operate before we vote on the issue.
And Pat, if I could just, for clarification, I believe I just heard you characterize this as essentially an opt-out provision, and I do see a lot of opt-out language in here, but I also see right up front essentially an opt-in requirement as well. I therefore consider it to be both. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Discussion on the motion. Richie White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess a question for Pat. Would you be willing to, let's see, where does it say about if you approve the abundance of Menhaden in state waters, would you change that to adjacent waters? Because there can be large amounts just outside state waters that could be harvested and landed in a state.
Pat?
Yeah, I would accept that as a friendly.
Is there any objection to amending the motion as just suggested? Seeing none, if staff could, John, are you objecting? Oh, so if staff could just make that tweak to the motion, there was no objection to it, so that would be considered a friendly amendment, and that will go forward without objection from the board, unless I see Robert Boyles objecting. Robert?
No objection, just a question for clarification. Richie, do you intend, is adjacent indicating federal waters? We're not bunched up like y'all are up there, so, I mean, what is adjacent?
I would mean federal waters when I say adjacent. So I guess we could change it to state and federal and/or federal.
All right, thank you. Back to comments, and I have Jim Gilmore next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pat, the concept of it's fine. The thing I'm getting stuck on is at the start of each fishing year. So if you read through that, we're going to be doing quite a bit of administrative work every year for staff and then back at the states to go through this whole thing. So it seems to be a lot of work. I mean, is there a possibility that maybe we could do this at a longer time period? Because, again, that's a lot to go through each year. And again, some of it's going to be a bit of a crystal ball because you're going to start at the fishing year and try to decide if you're going to, what's going to happen later on in the year. Like we've been seeing the last 2 years with Menhaden. I don't have a problem this fall. Last year I had fish kills all over the place. So, you know, it just got a little bit more complicated. So that's my only hang up, is really that we'd have to repeat this every year.
Pat, a response?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jim. It's not meant to be administratively burdensome. If a state is going to receive its allocation, it's just to ensure that that state gives a heads up that it doesn't need all of its allocation. Now, I certainly understand that there's a crystal ball available here, that it's probably cloudy, depending on how the state wants to promulgate its fishery. In this case, what I'm looking for is for some more certainty up front in regards to what may be available for a fishery. And then if the state does ask for it, tries to move forward with the fishery, you don't have the fish, there's the potential for an or for a quota transfer provision to be voted on later in the day. So again, I'm not looking for making this administratively burdensome.
Let me go to John Clark next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is very interesting. Pat, I just had a few process questions on it. When you say a fixed minimum or receive all or part of this amount, are you looking at that in increments, or could a state just request anything up to whatever the minimum chosen? And then the second is, how does this work in with the incidental catch? Are you looking to use this minimum so that we no longer have an incidental catch provision? Does it tie into that? Because we're a state that has used the incidental catch provision pretty heavily over the last few years. Thanks.
Pat?
So I'm going to start with the second. So this has nothing to do with any incidental or small-scale fisheries. This is purely for the allocation options that are potentially in play after a TAC would be set. And John, remind me of your first question, because unlike Jay, I can handle one at a time, not two.
Well, I'm just wondering, when you say a fixed minimum, receive all or part of this amount, this could get kind of messy each year. Would a state change how much they're requesting each year? For example, if it was like a 2% minimum, that's, I think, about 100 times more than we're actually landing in a state like Delaware. So we could just request part of that, but do you want it in like 0.5%, 1%, 2%? Just for administrative purposes, I'm just wondering what would be simplest here.
I think it could come in just about any way, shape, or form, whether it's you wanted 50% of your quota available to that state, or naming it as a pound. I think staff's going to have to translate that into what that number is for the board to, or for them to send out a redistributed amount to the states to be able to harvest.
Tom Foti. Are you passing, Tom? David Bush. David Warden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not speaking pro or con, it just goes back to Jim's point about the administration. Would it simplify the administration if we just put a date in this, for instance, prior to December 31 or whatever other date? I'm not proposing that. January. Well, I think the problem, as I understood Jim's issue, is the fishing year starts January 31st. Doesn't the fishing year start on January 1st?
Yes.
See, to me, maybe I didn't understand Jim's point totally correctly, but to me, the part of the mechanics of this is that this is going to have a direct impact on allocations that are spread in other portions of this FMP. So to me, it would make sense to just back it up to December 1. Prior to December 1, for the following fishing year, you would specify this, and then the staff would then have the ability to calculate the shares and splits of the quota for the state and send out a memo to that effect. But maybe I'm not following this.
Megan, do you want to just speak to the comment you just offered me?
Yeah, I'll just remind the board that we don't finalize the quotas for that current year until April when we get the compliance reports, because we're not going to know overages or unused quota, things like that. And so at the May meeting, that's when we come to you guys with final quotas for that fishing year. So the intent was to be a bit ahead of that, but that's how we do it now.
Dave, a follow?
Yeah, disregard everything I just said.
Next, I have Adam Nowalski.
For clarity's sake, the start of this motion begins with if the fixed minimum auction is selected. So is the intent of this to only apply if we select option C or option E from the allocation decision? Is that the belief here? And if that is in fact the belief, I would consider, I think this is good discussion to have as a precursor to that, knowing what a state or some other states may be thinking. But if this would apply only to those, perhaps it might be best to proceed with tabling this motion until after we have the allocation method discussion, but at least we've had this precursor to know what we might be looking at.
If put in the form of a motion, we could consider that suggestion. Next, I'm going to go to Senator Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess because this is such a new denomination in Connecticut, one of my concerns is that I don't know how quickly, that is the first year, you could ever demonstrate that you have the ability to catch whatever your quota might be. I could almost imagine that after a year, we could look at this again and make a determination whether or not some states ever intended to catch any of their quota. But the winner in that, if that were to occur, would be conservation, in my view. So if we were not able to get up to speed and completely allocate £1 million or whatever, the harm in that case would be, I guess, that the environment wins, if you believed in conservation. So I would suggest that this is premature. I appreciate the conversation, but I think it's premature on that front. And also, just because you didn't get your quota in 1 year doesn't mean, how would you then demonstrate, as the rest of the paragraph goes on, that you have the ability to actually use your quota? And so I do have one question, I guess, and that is there any other species where we have this requirement? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
I see heads shaking in the negative by staff, so it's my understanding that there are no other species for which we have a provision like this.
Thank you. So I know there were some other people that wanted to speak, but I think it's premature. Thank you.
Lauren Lustig.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry for my sore throat. I was earning a living yesterday, so I didn't get a chance to be here. I'm going to defray my spot to speak to my colleague Andy Shields, but I would like to be allowed to offer comments after he is concluded, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
And Andy, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Lauren. Senator Baker raises a good point. If I read this from the lens of Pennsylvania, it feels like we're being targeted here. And I feel like the state of Pennsylvania should have the right to do with its allocation what it chooses to do. And as he suggested, the winner might be conservation if you don't harvest your entire allocation, and then how would you prove it? So, somebody said, hang on. Oh, he was talking on the phone. I thought he meant me. So, who knows in this room? So, I'm concerned as I'm starting to understand what's going on here. I feel like Pennsylvania should have the right to do what it wishes with its allocation. And if it chooses to use that allocation as a set-aside or reserve for conservation, that language doesn't allow us to do that. So, thank you.
Lauren, did you want to follow now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Everyone here knows that I am not a fishery scientist. I am an environmental educator. So I always hearken back to the wishes of the children of Pennsylvania. My proposal is to vote for this amendment. However, we reserve in Pennsylvania the right of the children to choose the gear that is used to collect our part of the commercial harvest. And I'd be willing to bet they're going to use the lousiest gear you can possibly imagine, full of tears and rips. And about 99.5% of our commercial harvest is going to escape unharmed back into the water. But we will harvest, we will abide by the specifications of this amendment with about 1/2%. All right? Because the children of Pennsylvania wish it. In fact, my grandchildren demand it, and I'm not going to turn my back on them. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob O'Reilly.
So I think if there is a motion made to table, I think that's the way to go. You know, I know that Pat has put up sort of an idea here on how things could go, but it is too early, and there's no magnitude here. I think Pat did that on purpose just to sort of get the opt-in or opt-out, but it is too early, so I agree with that. Thank you.
Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would not be opposed to actually seeing this tabled for discussions as it relates to option C and E. I think Adam's points are valid. That was going to be my original intent, but I wanted to ensure that we had a good conversation around this opt-in, opt-out concept. Frankly, from my point of view, allowing for this type of opt-in or opt-out provision allows me to consider a lower TAC amount, because if we know what we're going to get up front versus at the end of the season, the state of Maine could be better prepared to understand what our targets will be, and understanding that up front also allows us to consider a more conservative TAC at the end of the day. Thank you.
Pat, would you like to make a motion to table? Or do you want to allow, I'm sorry, I didn't want to put words in your mouth. I wasn't sure if that's where you're going. Maybe not. Adam?
Move to table until after we've had the issue 2 discussion.
Is there a second to the motion to table?
The issue 2 decision.
There is this moved by Adam Nowalski, seconded by Rob O'Reilly, to table this motion, which would postpone consideration of it until later in the meeting. So it just sets it aside temporarily, and it can be brought back later in this meeting. It's not debatable. Is there any need to caucus? Megan?
Just get clarity on what issue 2 is. What do you mean by that?
Allocation methods and timeframes.
So tabling does not move it to a time or point certain in the meeting, although it can be brought back at any time that anyone wishes it to. So to me, the motion to table just simply puts it in abeyance for the time being to be brought back at any point during this meeting. Are you comfortable with that, Adam, or do you wish to change your motion to postpone to a time certain?
I believe the motion to table is very direct about when this would come back off of the table and in front of the board for discussion.
Understood. So let me read the motion into the record. Actually, I have it in front of me, I think. No, I don't. Move to table until after issue 2, allocation methods and timeframes has been decided. Again, it's because it's a motion to table, it's not debatable. Is there any need to caucus? Seeing none, is the board ready to vote? I believe so. All in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. Hands down. Opposed? Null votes? Abstentions? The motion carries unanimously. Would any other member of the board like to make a motion or have Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To remove it from the table is only going to require a majority vote.
Yeah, that's correct. The floor is now open for any other motions on any other issues. Jim Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get back to specifications if we could, please.
Go ahead.
I think that we have a motion. If I can put it up there, I'll read it, and if I can get a second, I'll explain. I move to set the total allowable catch not to exceed 216,000 metric tons until such a time the ecological reference points are utilized for Atlantic Menhaden management.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Spud Woodward. Moved by Jim Estes and seconded by Spud Woodward to set a total allowable catch not to exceed 216,000 metric tons until such time that ecological reference points are utilized for Atlantic Menhaden management. Jim?
So I know that we yesterday we disappointed a bunch of our stakeholders. I think we did the right thing, but part of the reason of their disappointment is they feel like we could easily kick the can down the road as far as developing these ecological reference points. I think that this motion does a couple things. Number one, I think it would hopefully give them some confidence that we mean it, and also because we are tying it to allocation, or to the TAC, which we all think is important, it makes us somewhat accountable, and so that's the purpose of the motion.
Thank you. Show of hands, who would like to speak in favor of this motion? Keep your hands up. We'll take questions. First of all, I just want to get a sense, so I want to be able to allow for a balanced discussion. So I've got two. You can put your hands down. Those who wish to speak in opposition to the motion, or even leaning toward that. And I will give everyone on the board a chance. I just want to get an initial list going. And I'm sorry, who was it? Somebody just asked, was it Steve that you just had, a question. So are you on the list? Did you put your hand up? Well, we'll put you on the list, Steve. So you're on the list. Okay. I'm going to ask Megan for that list, and I'm going to go right down in order in which she wrote it, starting with Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to speak in favor of it, but first, a question, if I may, and that would be that this is open-ended time-wise, and if a situation arose by which Menhaden declined substantially and we had to take a cut in the quota, this would not alter our ability to do that. So that would be my question first, and then I'd like to speak to the motion.
Jim?
Oh, that was my intention, was that we could go down, but we can't go up.
Thank you. I agree with the concept. I think 216 is a compromise. I know there's states that would like to see 240, and there's states that would like to see 200. I think 216 is an excellent compromise in the middle. I think 216 with a individual state allocation that I also believe will come up later, I think allows Virginia and New Jersey to stay whole while allocation goes to all the states that don't presently have allocation. And I think that's a fair compromise. So I think this, it also leaves Menhaden in the water compared to 240,000 metric tons. So I think all said, it's something we should support. Thank you.
Adam Nowalski.
So I'll get right to it. I've always said that Menhaden's one of the easier species for me here around the table because of the involvement of the assemblyman that I represent, very involved with the fisheries. And his goal at home was that the health of the resource argues in favor of something more. I'm going to move to substitute to set a total allowable catch of 240,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019.
The motion is up on the board. Is there a second? Seconded by Dave Bush. So I'm going to stay true to my procedural plan to allow discussion on both the main motion and the substitute as we did yesterday. So it's really, you know, speaking in favor of the substitute is often the same as speaking against the main motion. So there really isn't much of a distinction here. However, I just want to make it clear that as you comment on the now substitute motion, you're welcome to comment as well on the main motion, offering your support for the main or your support for the substitute. That's how I'd like to handle the ensuing discussion. I'm going to continue down the list and go to Allison Colden next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to speak in opposition to the substitute motion. There was a lot of discussion of this body yesterday about the concepts of intellectual honesty and integrity, and along those lines, option E was seen as or characterized as a not conservative option. Along those lines, I would challenge the board to think about whether 240,000 metric tons is indeed a conservative alternative to that option. Additionally, we talked about not selecting a target that is arbitrary relative to the current reference points. We currently have a fecundity reference point, which we are not achieving the target. And it would seem, following that conversation, that a tax should be set which would move towards achieving both the fecundity and the fishing mortality rate targets. And so I would support in concept the main motion. I think that Jim provided a lot of strong suggestions on why we should put some real momentum behind the development of the Menhaden specific ERPs. I think we heard in the spoken public comment yesterday some great points about really putting some weight behind the board's commitment to moving towards the Menhaden specific ERPs, and I think that the main motion would achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you. John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I don't support the substitute, and I think it's important here to give you guys a perspective of somebody who spends most of their life on the water and that who is absolutely dependent on this resource. My season is dictated by spatial and temporal aggregations of Menhaden. It is absolutely the driver of my business and a lot of businesses up the coast now. And as you guys are very well aware, we've had this superabundance of fish that's flooded our coast. I'm enjoying it right now. It's right off of the south shore of New York. With it is our striped bass, whales. We took my son out the day before. We had one come up right by the boat. He screamed his first cuss word. It was awesome. I tried to act angry, but I just couldn't. But the point is that this is not some oily bait fish that can just be sucked up without impacting everybody else. This is a huge increase. And I know that
there's no stock recruitment relationship, and I understand environmental factors that probably contributed to this resurgence that we're having now. But to say that that reduction had nothing to do with this abundance of fish, I don't understand it. I think it defies common sense. And not only are we going back to those pre-2013 levels, we are exceeding them by a lot. And if there's anybody around this table who believes that's not going to affect the coastal stock, that we're not going to see a contraction again, I hope that you are in touch with the public about this. And they want this abundance. This is good for them. It's good for us. And this is absolutely irresponsible to even suggest this right now when we had all this public comment. And frankly, I can't see how anybody would support it. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't support the substitute motion. I think, we have been on the record in the past as supporting modest increases in the TAC when the science allows for that. We received our assessment update in August, which indicated stability in the assessment and indicated that we were below both our fishing mortality target and thresholds based on our fecundity reference points. And one of the other things that we have emphasized in the past is that significant changes in the TAC do not provide stability to industry. And so that's why we would be more supportive of the main motion. I think also echoing some of the comments that have already been made around the table, modest adjustments in the TAC better position us to implement the Menhaden specific ecological reference points that we've made a commitment to down the road. Thank you.
David Borden.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Richie made one of the points, and Michelle just made the second point, so I'll make the third point, which is I'm opposed to the substitute motion, and just note that really, to me, the deciding difference here is motion 8 caps the catch at 216, and motion 9 basically establishes the catch for 2 years based on that level. So there's a significant difference between the two. Thank you.
Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to look at this a little differently. I don't support the 216,000 metric ton TAC because just like we heard with what Pat Kelleher presented earlier, everything's nested here. If we had a huge blackboard with arrows, we could probably wend our way through this process a lot easier. But to say 216,000 metric tons is right. We don't know what that means yet. Is that going to be the total? What happens to bycatch? What happens to episodic events? Things that may make a difference. So you've heard about the pound net fishery in Maryland and Virginia. Depending on what is attached to this 216,000 metric tons has a lot to do with where we end up today. So, my particular desire here is just to say that I don't agree with 216,000 metric tons because we don't know what else is going to go along with that. We have a menu, but really the menu as we go through it, is interwoven in a sense, and it makes it very difficult at this time to support 216,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Train, did you still want to offer a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot of the questions I had have been answered, but I think I like the hard dates in the substitute motion. The open-ended dates in the first part make me nervous. We're hoping to have everything out by 2019, but we might not. And if we have a very healthy resource, we have room to move up a little bit from 216, and we wouldn't be able to do that. I think 214 sounds reasonable sometimes when I see the statistics we have, but I also see the fecundity numbers, and I think that it may be a little bit overreaching. I think we have a possibility of increasing the harvest on this resource for years and years, a little to a time, if we don't take too much at once, and I think that benefits every user of it. So there are parts of each one of these motions I could speak in favor of, but Either one of them individually, I'm not quite ready for.
And Steve, just for clarification, you said 214. Did you mean 240 in your comment just now? Thank you. That was a yes for the record. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I oppose the substitute motion in favor of the original motion for all the reasons that have been stated thus far, but also I have to look at the optics of this situation. The original motion has a modest increase, about 8%, and I think that's prudent considering the overwhelming public support that we heard yesterday. So I think it's a little premature at this time to bump it up to 240,000 metric tons. Thank you.
Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Surely everything's been said on this subject at this point. I don't support the substitute motion like many of my colleagues, and I think we've heard enough discussion about where everyone individually stands, so it's clear to me that it's time to make a vote on how big the pie is going to be. And then following that, we'll figure out how many pieces of pie that we're going to cut it up into. So I'd like to ask that we think about taking a vote, because I don't think that any further discussion is going to change anyone's point of view at this time. Thank you.
I do have 3 others on my list. I'd like to at least move through those and then see whether the board does want to call the question. Next, I have Robert Boyles.
I'll pass, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Lauren Lustig.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If Dr. Seuss was here in the room with us, he would remind us of the limitless forest of truffula trees. And wouldn't you know it, something called a thneed could be made from them. And if you're wondering what the final outcome of over-harvestation was, I can tell you at our break. And if I do reserve the right sometime today to use the word unless, and some of you will also remember that. Thank you.
Pat Kelleher.
I'm going to refrain from my Dr. Seuss quote that I was going to go into, but I'm going to speak against the substitute motion while I support setting a TAC for the 2018 and 2019 years. I think, as Dr. Duvall stated, an incremental step in moving forward, I think, is called for at this time. Thank you.
I was just going to ask the board if there was any objection to ending debate and calling the question. 2 hands went up. So I'm going to go to those 2 hands, and then I'm going to ask that same question. Dr. Rhodes.
Thank you. Listen, all the discussions we've had, this board is committed to the ecological reference points, and it's just a matter of how we're getting there. 33 years ago, I took another doctor's commitment that was to first do no harm. But I really want to go back to what Hippocrates said and of the epidemic. So I'm doing a Robert Boyles to get us all in place here. But the physician must be able to tell the antecedents, know the present, and foretell the future. Must meditate these things and have 2 special objects in view with regard to disease. And we can substitute Menhaden, namely to do good or to do no harm. I think the 240, while it may be allowable, is not allowing for the least likelihood of doing no harm and doing the most good for the resource. The 216 will make a lot of people whole, will allow for states that want allocation to get it without negatively affecting states that currently have allocation, and having it set until the ERP is ready to go allows the staff to not get caught up, or this management board to get caught up in setting these same discussions year after year after year, hopefully allowing the ERP to be done that much more rapidly. So in a 2-year or 3-year time period, we're ready to have the next level of discussion. So a different doctor, but same process. Thank you.
David Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, once again, we've got some excellent points around the table and points of view to consider. Some of the things that we've talked about is stability, and we do need that. We need that in the industry. We need that in the environment. I completely respect that. But we talk about stability a lot more when we're considering an increase. However, whenever the numbers start dropping, well, stability is not as important as the resource. Okay, well, I get that. I mean, it's got to play fair both ways given that setup. But the other thing is the promises that we made yesterday. I had some interesting conversations yesterday evening and you know, was put on the spot, and I agree. I think we made some promises and we wrote some checks that we need to make sure that the bank has the money to cover when it comes up here in a few years. We've mentioned the conservative nature of one number over the other. And just to point a couple of numbers out, I looked up yesterday while we was discussing this. From 1950 to 2016, our average landings in metric tons were 333,000 metric tons. From 1950 to 1980, it was 410,000 metric tons. And from 80 to 2016, it was 266,000 metric tons. Keep in mind that we haven't exceeded 266,000 metric tons since before 1995. But up through 2016, that's still our average. So as far as being conservative, we're talking about 216 to 240. And I was looking yesterday at the numbers put up on the board, and it seems like that 230, 240 appears to be a crossover point to where once you get above that, some of the zeros start shifting into whole numbers. And I don't know if maybe this would be appropriate, if makers of the motions might consider it, maybe amending the motion to include some of the better values of both of these motions. And if so, I'd be willing to do that if I could get some help.
Yeah, I think here's how I'd like, first of all, I'd like to ask, is there any member of the board who has not yet spoken on either of these motions who would like to speak? Seeing none and taking David Bush's comment into consideration, is there any objection to calling the question and moving forward with the vote on the substitute? Seeing no objection, we will caucus for 1 minute and then vote on the substitute. All right, I'm going to call the question. This is a vote on the move to substitute to set a total allowable catch of 240,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Hands down. All opposed, please raise your hand. Hands down. Null votes. Abstentions. The motion fails 4-14. We're back to the main motion. Further discussion on the main motion. David Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned earlier, there are some very valid points in both. I think we need to, in my opinion, as soon as the ERPs are out, use them. That needs to be in there. I think specified years, it's been important, mentioned a few times, that we need to mention those exactly as well. And while I think I agreed to second the motion with 240,000, it was more for discussion purposes, but also because I believe that these modest increases, while they're great, to say that they're modest, these folks who rely on stability also rely on good years, and they never experience the good years, only the bad. I think looking at the numbers that we've looked at yesterday, we can certainly see that there's quite a few higher numbers that has been shown to be more than fair to both the environment and the fishery. With that being said, if you're willing to take an amended motion or to amend this motion to include some of those finer points, I would appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome to do so if you'd like.
All right, so, and I'll need some assistance, but I would move to amend to set the total allowable catch not to exceed 220,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019. And sorry, help with the wording, but or if the ecological reference points are available before then, however we would best word that.
Staff is putting the motion up on the board. Dave, I take this actually to be another move to substitute. Are you comfortable making that? I don't see this as an amendment. Okay.
That's fine. But I would want the maximum time frame to be 2 years. I want it to be readdressed. If we do not have these ERPs available by then, it needs to be addressed and not continue on. And if you, whenever you're ready, I'd like to speak to it for just a moment.
Yeah, let's just make sure we get it correct. So first of all, and I realize this is a fine point, it could well be an amendment, but I just would like to suggest that it read move to substitute. So Max, if you could make that change, to set a total allowable catch not to exceed 220,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019, or until ecological reference points are available for management use, whichever is first. Dave, is that your intent to make that motion?
Yes, I don't believe it needs to be specified, but I'm referring to the species-specific ecological reference points, but if that needs to be in there, then that's fine as well.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Rachel Dean. Dave, discussion on the motion?
Yes, sir, and I mentioned this a lot. I'm the new kid on the block here. I'm trying to understand what our goals here when we show up at each one of these meetings, and I've talked to some of you earlier. You know, on the federal side, it's pretty easy. There's a lot more doctrine. There's a lot more guidance. These are the goals. This is what you should be striving towards. And here, it's not quite so easy. But I understand that we need to take care of the environment. I understand we need to take care of those who rely on it as well. And I really do believe if we're willing to provide reductions to protect a fishery in a bad year, we should also have the intellectual honesty to provide the ability to harvest during good years as well. Now, that may go against the philosophy of stability, but at the same time, you can't only have average years and bad years. There's only one way to get an average year, and that's to take a bad year and provide a good year to offset it. But I think this does that. I think arguing once again for numbers simply because they're round is silly, and I hate to be part of a discussion that does that like we did last year. I chose 220 because I think 220 is the point where a lot of our zeros turn into, again, whole numbers when we're talking about the possibility of exceeding certain targets or thresholds. That's my reason for choosing 220. And if the secretary would like to provide any other comment, I would appreciate it.
Rachel, I will go to you, but first, just by a show of hands, who else would like to speak? I'm assuming Rachel wants to speak in favor, although she doesn't necessarily need to. Is there anyone, who else on the board would like to speak in favor of this motion to substitute? Just put your hands up so I can go down the list, at least initially. I see 3 hands. Thank you. Those who wish to speak in opposition? I see 2. And with that, I will go to Rachel Dean.
Dr. Seuss. I am here.
School teachers.
Yeah. I struggled with this. My first meeting, I got to go through as we were setting the TAC the last time, and it was brutally painful. But there's something that has always resonated with me as I've participated in fisheries management, and that is that we are so quick to take and so reserved when it's time to give credit where credit is due. And I've heard both sides of the argument. I have heard that decreasing the TAC did nothing, which I would sit here and apologize to fishermen then. And that weight is on me now as I look at a 0% chance a 0% chance of exceeding the F target, which means a 100% chance of not exceeding the F target. And if this was successful management, if this got us to where we are, to where we're starting to see a resurgence of Menhaden bunker peanuts up and down the coast, then I would ask that we give some credit where credit is due. And this isn't putting us back to harvest levels that got us into an awful situation. This is by no means putting us back to where we are. This is just putting us somewhere where we have put credit into the management system so far and saying to our fishermen that management does work. Have a little faith, because it will be given back to you when it allows for it. So, thank you.
Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to oppose the substitute motion. And there's also a piece of giving and taking. It certainly is for the fishermen, but there's also for the resource that needs Menhaden. So we're certainly going to take some from all the description we've heard about the whales, the bluefish, the striped bass, the birds that also need Menhaden. And we've had a lot of comments about the support for ecological reference points. Clearly those, when we get those, are going to have us leave more Menhaden in the water. And I think the 216 is a compromise from the people I talked with last night and yesterday afternoon that was hearing 201,000 as a possible motion and 240. And I think the 216 is a fair motion. I also oppose putting the dates in there. And I oppose putting the dates in there because what if the reference points are not ready in 2019? Do we want to go through this process again for 1 year? I don't think so. So I think the original motion allows a little bit of time to make sure that the reference points are in place. Thank you.
Russ Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought Rachel hit all the points very well, so I won't reiterate what she had to say. I just know that this, to me, is a good compromise between the resource and the fishing industry. And if we decide to move forward with some sort of fixed minimum, it should make everyone whole and give everyone enough of the resource for their own states. And so I think it's really is the good between 200 and 240. And, you know, as Rachel said, there's a 0% chance of going over the target with this number. And that came from the technical committee, which I believe would have no problem moving forward with this either. So thank you.
John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is bizarre to me. This is a public resource. And it's like nobody looked at or read the public comment or went to the public hearings. The public wants enough of these fish to stay in the water, so they have access to these whales, they have access to the striped bass, access to the bluefish. Does anybody care what the public wants? A 20,000 pound increase is a lot of fish. It's hundreds and millions of fish. The analysis that we have right now on impact is single species. It's based on a single species stock assessment. We have no idea what the impact on predators will be. And I would argue that we should wait to see what that impact is and that we know the trade-offs. We have science to base those decisions on before doing something like this, which is just way over the top, in my opinion. And frankly, 16,000 metric tons is a hard pill for me to swallow, but I think it's reasonable. 20,000 pounds is not. And the public, frankly, is going to flip about this, and they have a good reason to. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
John, and you several times said 20,000 pounds. You meant 20,000 metric tons, I believe.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
David Blazer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in support of the substitute motion. I think the 220,000 metric tons is kind of a moderate increase based on what the technical committee has provided for us and the risks that are involved there. I'm also supportive of just setting this for the 2 years. You know, we fully want the ecological reference points to be here as soon as possible. We kind of mentioned that yesterday. But I think, you know, if we start to manage to that 3rd and 4th year out, I think we need kind of a 2-year timetable to kind of reevaluate at that time. And if we've got to go through a tax setting exercise in 2 years, that's our responsibility. That's us as management board. So I feel very comfortable in making those decisions in 2 years, and I think that's our job to do that. So I'm fully supportive of the motion to substitute. Thank you.
Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not in support of the substitute motion. One of the comments that struck me this morning, we've talked about Dr. Seuss and other things to add a little levity to the conversation, but a comment that John made across the table, having his son out there and seeing a whale and saying, awesome. Well, this spring, or early summer, Richie White took me and my grandson from Milwaukee out striper fishing. And my grandson caught a nice striper, and his first comment was, awesome. And the awesome came from the fact that the stripers that we were catching this summer were extremely healthy. I don't know if it has a lot to do with Menhaden in particular, but Richie White and I fished a lot, and we would always, when we had a fish on the line, how big, how big? And Richie would always overestimate the size of them because the fish were seemed to be so strong. What I'm getting at is the general public wants to see Menhaden in the water. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people from. Thank you, but hold that back. We don't need that. We appreciate it, but we don't need it. But it's true that the general public wants to see fish in the water. Whether it's 216, 220 might seem like a small figure, but I think the general public would really like to see that number under 200,000. If you really get down to it, they don't want to see the extraction of Menhaden to go to fish meal or a lot of products that, for whatever, that they don't understand, but they understand what they see out in the water. And for that reason, I think that there's a compromise figure of 216, which comes out, it should keep most people whole, give all the states some piece of the pie, and keep the states of Virginia and New Jersey hopefully in a good position. So I urge you to vote down the substitute motion, vote on the main motion, because if we could go on all day. We can go from 220, we can go 280. Maybe I'll be prepared to make a motion next, or if 220 passes, to make another motion for 214. But 216 seems to be the best compromise figure, and I urge my colleagues to vote down the substitute motion, vote for the main motion of 216,000 metric tons, and let's move on to the allocations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't know about a compromise when you start off with 216,000 metric tons. I'm not sure we have a flowing recollection of all the different steps that we've taken. But I have heard repeatedly about making states whole again, specifically Virginia, New Jersey, and also Maryland. Starting in 2013, those were the 3 states that were above 1% in terms of the allocation. I think that during the allocation process, when Robert Boyles was hosting at least 8 calls, most of the comments were about capacity, and I kept urging through the series of those phone calls, capacity isn't what you're doing now. We want to know what capacity is as you look down the road a little bit. And I'm not sure that that ever occurred. I'm not sure there were ever enough discussions about what capacity really is. I do know Rhode Island has capacity that wasn't there many years ago, or at least the boats weren't ready to embark on taking some of that capacity from the total allowable catch. I also know that Maine ran into a situation where the episodic problem was more than episodic. It was bordering on catastrophic with the constructs that we have, and with the episodic being held at 1%. I also know that New York was sweating bullets, having gone through 2 seasons of Menhaden kills and somehow being included with New England, which is fine, in the episodic events. So we have these situations that when I saw 216,000, if you'll notice, I didn't speak in favor of 240,000. I said 216,000 is not the right amount. We have a little way to go. Pat Kelleher started this situation today and made me a little bit nervous because it was sort of open-ended on this minimal quota situation. And no matter where you look, you're talking minimum being 39 million with 0.5%, 70 million with 1%, and 83 millions that probably couldn't be used out of 141 million that would be for 2%. And I know everyone has good intentions, and I think they stand by that, and I stand with them in terms of the reference points, but we made a decision, and the decision was we're still united. We want those biological, ecological reference points. We have a pretty good feel that it's going to be sometime in 2019 for peer review. So I think the substitute motion gives a little more assurance that 2 things can be captured today. One will be to make states whole on a situation which I'm not going to recount. Unfortunately, many of you remember, as I do, what we've been through, all the steps, so I won't recount them on where we are today compared to where we were in 2012. The second thing is there is capacity that hasn't been there before, and that has to be recognized, and that is fair. And I can't tell you right now how many Menhaden are left in the water, because when they did the updated assessment and you had the NAD situation, you had those northern fish which sort of perturbed the model a little bit. It's difficult to say whether the 68% that were left in the water at the time of the benchmark is higher or not. We just don't know. And I have asked that question because there is concern for forage, definite concern. There's also a concern by all of us for forage in the form of herring, forage in the form of the Alocines. Menhaden is not exactly the only forage species out there, and I think as we go through this, whatever we do, we ought to start making renewed commitments on the Alocines. And we ought to get the New England Council to maybe make some renewed commitments on herring. So thank you for your time. I do support the substitute motion.
Allison Colden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to make a comment and maybe reframe, actually Rob just touched on this, reframe the concept of the timelines that are included in each of these motions. Option B was adopted as our reference points yesterday by this board, with many of the comments expressing confidence that the Menhaden specific ERPs would be ready for prime time in 2019, or at least out for peer review. So personally, I don't see, if the board was so confident in that fact yesterday, why it would be necessary to change or limit the tax setting exercise here for 2 years if there was a high level of confidence that those models would be ready, as we saw in our discussions yesterday. Thank you.
Ray Kane.
Yes, I'm going to speak. I'm going to oppose the substitute. I'm in favor of the main motion. I've heard around the table, fishermen want to see an increase. Well, if I'm not mistaken, we started at 185,000 metric ton, then we went to 200,000 metric ton, and once again, we're increasing. So fishermen should be able to walk away from here saying, well, we did get an increase. What nobody has reflected on is the bluefin tuna fishery in New England. And for the first time in years, the vessels, 35 and 40-foot vessels, didn't have to steam 130 miles out to the Hague line to catch the quota in general category. We had fish, many fish were landed within 3 miles of the coast this year, and I'd venture to say vessels didn't have to fish more than 30 miles offshore. And if you've ever fished for a living, you know what I'm talking about when you're on a 35-foot vessel or a 100-foot vessel. 100-foot vessels belong 130 miles offshore. 35-foot vessels don't. And my concern is also ecological reference points. I think this is a modest increase. People will be happy with it. And I've had a lot of constituents back home, the bluefin tuna fishermen especially, tell me, why are they going to raise it at all? We finally have Menhaden back in our waters. I mean, we had 800-pound bluefin tuna in 30 feet of water this year. Part of them came up in 30 feet of water. And to address Mr. O'Reilly, you know, there's an issue with herring. There's a reason why all these big animals came that close to shore, because of the abundance of Menhaden on the backside of Cape Cod. So once again, I oppose the substitute. I'm in favor of the main motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone who has not yet spoken on this substitute who would like to? David, you had your hand up. Last crack, final comment, then we'll vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of points I guess I would like to bring out. One, we've talked about reinvesting, you know, for a conservatory effect. And given the allocation schemes, and states can do what they want with what they get. So if their particular state is now seeing, you know, an increase in Menhaden and whatnot, and they don't want to use that as a fishery base, that's up to that state to sort of determine what they would do with that, and we'll be discussing that in other options here shortly. But I mean, that's certainly the potential. I'm not saying that would be the case, but it could. But another thing I guess I'd like to point out, you know, our current trajectory, our management philosophy has gotten us where we are, not a particular number. And while it's nice that we've finally seen an increase from where we were to 200,000 metric tons, you know, we're also at the lowest point, the lowest harvest limit we've ever been at. Again, I spoke of the averages over the years. We've never come close to our average even over the past 20, 30 years, you know, for the last 10 years. And it's not because they're not out there, it's because they've been limited from catching it. And we've gotten to the point now where it's once again fighting over scraps. We forget the big picture, we forget that there's more fish, and we certainly don't want to do things to cause harm to the ecosystem, but we don't even have the capacity to harvest what we used to harvest for decades. And we still have those fish and the predators that relied on them. I've talked to the bad guys, the big bad guys that are in the room before, you know, before today, before this meeting. I've never once had them come to me and ask me, we need you to get all you can get, we want you to double the quotas. They've never asked that. They said, this appears to be what's fair. This appears to be what the science supports. You know, I've talked to them, I've talked to the other folks, and well, they say the same thing. This appears to be fair and what the science supports. If we're going to do a modest increase, and we have the range from about 200 to 240, 220, I mean, my math is a little rusty, but that seems about in the middle. And again, it doesn't cross over that threshold that starts putting us in harm's way. And then, I guess the final note, you know, the abundance is either due to our management actions or it is not. And if it is due to our management actions, we're doing the right thing. If it's not due to our management actions, then apparently we have less control than we thought. Thank you.
1 minute caucus, and then we'll vote on the motion to substitute. Okay, I'm going to call the question. I'm sorry, Andy?
Can we have a roll call vote, please?
We can, and we will. And we will move south to north, and Megan will call the roll.
All right. U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
No.
NOAA Fisheries.
No.
Florida.
No.
Georgia.
No.
South Carolina.
No.
North Carolina. No. Virginia.
Yes.
Potomac River.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
Delaware.
Yes.
Pennsylvania.
No.
New Jersey.
Yes.
New York.
No.
Connecticut.
No.
Rhode Island.
No.
Massachusetts.
No.
New Hampshire.
No.
Maine.
No.
The motion fails 5-13. We're back to the main motion, and I believe Megan has a suggested clarification on that, so I'm going to turn the mic over to Megan.
So for the main motion, this sets a number that the TAC cannot exceed, but this does not specify what the TAC is in 2018 and or 2019. So if the intent for the maker of the motion is to set it at 216, perhaps we could do a friendly amendment that it says move to set a total allowable catch to not exceed and be set at 216.
That's fine.
So let's put that up there. So the revised motion, which is the main motion, which is the motion before the board, is to move to set a total allowable catch not to exceed and be set at 216,000 metric tons until such time that ecological reference points are utilized for Atlantic menhaden management. I was going to ask if there's any objection to making that friendly amendment. Seeing no objection, the motion as amended is before the board, and we have apparently comments on it, starting with Roy Miller and then Rachel Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did I hear Megan mention 2018 and 2019 as part of that friendly motion? Because that wording didn't make it onto the board.
I didn't. I think the intent, and makers of the motion, please correct me, was that there not be years in this. So I have not put in years, but I was just trying to clarify that the 216 is actually the TAC that they are interested in.
Rachel, Dean?
I'd like to think that this is a friendly amendment, but I think that we're probably going to want it as a substitute motion, if I may. Can I do that at this time?
Well, there's a big difference between a friendly and a substitute, so...
So let me read it out. let me share where I'm going, and we'll go. I think that I'd like to move to make a substitute motion that it say, move to set a total allowable catch not to exceed and be set at 216 metric tons for 216,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019, or until such a time that ecological reference points are utilized for Atlantic menhaden management.
So I don't think that's a friendly. It could be an amendment. It could be a substitute. Let's just call it as substitute, just to kind of keep on track here. So
and I'd like to speak to it if I can.
I'll give you that chance. I just want to make sure that it's up on the board clearly and accurately as you intend. So this would be to, once Max gets done, move to substitute to set a total allowable catch not to exceed and be set at 216,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019, or until such time that until such time that Menhaden specific ecological reference points be available for management use. Is that your intent? Is that your motion, Rachel?
Yes.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Steve Train. Rachel, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you. I just, at this point in time, I want to, I guess I'm really kind of, Richie White said it, that, you know, I don't really think that I want to go through this again. And to be honest, I'll go through it as many times as I need to. I will. I'll come here. I'll pack the bags and I'll come here. And to be honest, I think that the public will too. So this isn't necessarily so that only the fishermen can state their case, but I think that I want the reference points. I'm ready for them. I just don't know if we can accomplish the time frame. And if we see something that tells us that we can increase that TAC, then I think that we should come back to the table and we should have that discussion. Just like we included the language that says not to exceed, so suggesting that we could reduce that. Thank you.
Thank you. And just so I understand exactly what this would do, this would set the quota at 216,000 metric tons for 2018 and 2019. You know, this issue of that it can't exceed, I'm not really sure how that plays in now, but so I'm looking for clarification from either you or other members of the board as to how they would view this. And then it goes on to say, or until such time that Menhaden specific reference points, which I guess would imply that it could happen sooner, and if it does, they would trump. But if they don't happen sooner, it would be 216 for 2018 and 2019. And I'm just sort of wrestling in my own head with what not to exceed now, how that plays into this. Rachel?
Yes, and we'd be back here at 200, and we'd be back here at 2020. And I'll leave the second part of that question to, I guess, back to maybe the seconder.
And that would be Steve Train. So, Steve, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I seconded this, my understanding would be that with the dates on there, we could decide after 2019 whether to continue to wait if the numbers were not available, or we could act and set a new number. That's where the or is. That's what I thought I was seconding. And the reason I think that that's important is, although we have a lot of faith in getting the ecological reference point numbers out for 2020, if the peer review doesn't accept it or we run into other problems, we could be into 2023 working under 216,000 metric tons. So I think a date certain is important, but it gives us a chance to extend it if we think we're getting close with this or in this part of the motion.
Thank you. Robert Boyles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a good conversation, and I'm struggling with this as well. I think my interest in this portion of the discussion and the debate is, and Mr. Estes made the comment at the very beginning about accountability. I think in some of my conversations over the last several weeks, I may have shared with you concerns over further delays in biological ecological reference points. My interest in the main motion, as I understand it, and in reference to Mr. Estes, this was some internal accountability. Having said that, and I would look to you, Mr. Chairman, I don't know that anything that we do here today necessarily binds a future board. If conditions change, I would think that, as Ms. Dean referenced, we would come back and look at those conditions to see what is it time for a course correction. But again, I think my interest in the main motion and I think in the substitute, I'm not clear, is some internal board accountability. To take Mr. McMurray's point, we had thousands, tens of thousands of comments from the public saying, y'all commit to y'all do this. Y'all do biological ecological reference points. I think the message, I hope, that was sent yesterday is we are committed. I've seen no disagreement about that around the table. This is just designed to provide a little bit more internal accountability. So I need to wrestle with the substitute, but again, if we can get to the substitute, if the substitute ensures that internal board accountability, then I can support it.
I've got Adam Nowalski next.
So I'm in support of the idea of adding a timeline. My question with the 2 years at this point, as we've gone through the discussion, and I know was my motion earlier, is that enough, or do we, if we're going to go down the road of holding ourselves accountable as a board, and before I get to that question, let me just say that accountability to ourselves and the public, you know, we've heard comments asking why we aren't doing exactly what the public asked us to do. Well, there were other comments that asked us to do certain things here. And just because we didn't do exactly what any one of those people wanted us to do didn't mean that we haven't considered it, and it hasn't strongly factored into our ultimate decision that we make around the table here today in future decisions. So I think all of that public comment on both sides is excellent, it's needed, and it helps hold us accountable, and I think that we're being responsive to it. But my question at this point is that should the ERPs get done, as we heard yesterday, what they're cautiously optimistic about, I think was the term I heard, and should they be peer reviewed in 2019, would our spec setting process for 2020 already have occurred by the time they're available to use, and would the time frame here not be better for 2018, 19, and 20 because our spec setting process would already have occurred in 2019?
So there's not obviously a date for that peer review yet in 2019. So I can't say what month that is going to occur, and it is important to consider that specification process for 2020. What I can say is that Amendment 3 says that the board can, following peer review of those Menhaden specific ERPs, can adopt those through board action or through an addendum process. So an amendment is not needed. So that would, if it's through board action, those could be implemented in 2020. An addendum would obviously take a little bit longer, but facilitates public comment if the board is interested in that.
Adam, do you have a follow?
So does staff feel if the cautiously optimistic timeline of development of ERPs comes to fruition, is 2018 and 2019 spec setting enough? Would those ERPs be useful to us in a reasonable time frame for 2020, or would we still need spec setting for 2020 without use of the ERPs?
Bob Beal?
Let me give it a try. Keep in mind that spec setting is not part of Amendment 3. That's outside the Amendment 3 framework. So specs are something that needs to be done, you know, either multi-year, single year, however this board chooses to do that. If 2020 is added to this motion, and I'm not saying if it should or shouldn't be, then if the ecological reference points are available and the board wants to modify the 2020 total allowable catch, that will take a 2/3 vote by the board. So Robert Boyles hinted at this a minute ago. You know, the actions of this board really can't tie the hands of any subsequent boards or subsequent meetings of this board. So even though this motion says 216, not to exceed 216 for the next 2 years, if there's a compelling reason and 2/3 of and this board votes through a 2/3 majority to make a change, even in 2019, they have that ability. You know, a board can't tie the hands of future boards. So ASMSC and the policy board and the charter reflect that. There's a commission-specific provision that any final actions taken by the commission, and spec setting is a final action, can be rescinded or modified through a 2/3 vote. So, you know, including 2020 in here would then have that 2/3 majority requirement in place to change 2020. So, you know, the flexibility is still there. The hurdle's just a little bit higher, and I think it would, you know, need to be compelling to more of the board to make a change in 2020. So that's the quick procedural summary where we are, and the board can decide where to go from there.
Dennis Abbott.
I'll pass.
Dr. Rhodes.
Well, this is just a question. I don't see a difference between these two motions other than we're setting a limit for 2 years and having an or in there. If we do not have the ecologic reference points ready in 2020, we default back to 216. It's an identical motion the way it's written with the or in there, I believe. I mean, I'll stand for other people reading it. But the way it reads is we're setting it for 18, 19, and then we have or. So if 2020 it's not ready, doesn't it default back to 216 the way it's currently written?
So let me do this. I have several folks on the list, but I'd like to ask if anyone has a response to the issue just raised by Dr. Rhodes. And I see 3 emphatic hands up, so I'm going to go left to right. Robert Boyles first.
Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. What is 2/3 vote of this board?
12.
It depends. The provisions of the charter say that 2/3 vote, there's 18 votes on this board, so 2/3 of the, I forget the math, but there's a provision that if the federal services abstain, the denominator can change, so it can be either 18, 17, or 16, depending on the number of the votes cast by the federal services, so it depends.
Rob O'Reilly. And if you could, Rob, just specifically to the point that Dr. Rhodes raised a minute ago regarding the difference between these two motions. I think it's important to kind of focus on that first, and then we'll go to the other comments.
Highly focused. I think, do we have a default position? Didn't we run into a little bit of trouble when we realized we really couldn't fall back to a quota from the previous year or a TAC? If that has not been remedied, then Dr. Rhodes' suggestion might run us into a problem again.
Are you speaking to the indecision clause that's in the document?
And what we did with the indecision clause, yes. So
we agreed that if the board could not agree on specifications for the next year, the specifications in place for the year, the last year, the current year, as it were, would continue forward. It would be a status quo situation.
Thank you, Dr. Rhodes.
Rachel Dean, on the specific issue of the difference between these two motions.
Yeah, I think that we've mentioned before that sometimes it's just to keep it in our memory. And by including the 2018 and 2019, my intention there was just that we would be reminded that these discussions can happen. And that is not to say that those discussions wouldn't happen if it wasn't in there. But again, I just want that reminder that the option is there.
Thank you. I have 4 more people on the list, and then I'm going to see if the board would like to move forward with voting on this. Next is Tom Foti.
Our long history of setting 2-year, 3-year specs had not worked out so well, especially with some of the species we've gone through, like summer flounder, black sea bass, and others. I agree with Malcolm. This is a lot of ado about nothing. Either one of the motions mean the same thing to me because we're going to bring it up for discussion, and I think it's clearer to do it. I guess the first motion just clearer. I don't like putting years in because we have a habit of pushing years off anyway. So the board can decide. It reminds me of New Jersey's budget. Most people don't realize in New Jersey that when you pass a budget every year, it supersedes all the other budgets. So all the dedicated funds you made for the last 20 years can be superseded by the next budget, which is unusual, I think, for any other state but New Jersey, because we do things kind of funny there. And this reminds me of that, because we always have the option of coming back and doing whatever we want the next following year. It just takes a 2/3 vote. And if anything that's strong, we should do it. So, I support 11 just because it makes it clearer.
Thank you. Dr. Duvall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was really more a point of information. My understanding in terms of time frame, with regard to the Menhaden specific ecological reference points, that the peer review is right now currently expected to be completed by 2019 in conjunction with the new benchmark assessment, correct? Okay, I'm seeing nods from staff around the table. That was the only point I wanted to bring up, is that those will be in conjunction with the new benchmark. Thank you.
Lauren Lustig.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to sincerely compliment Rachel for her use of the word honesty. And not only did she use it sort of introspectively for herself, she also referenced the honesty given to us by the recreational anglers who are in this room, who represent tens of thousands of additional recreational anglers. So I'm really big into honesty and civility during this discussion. Now, somebody mentioned the word levity recently, especially in regards to Dr. Seuss. I assure you, I am deadly, deadly serious about this whole matter. Okay, there's a time for levity, but there's also a time for serious consideration. Thank you.
Richie White? Pass. Last comment on this, Doug Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Dr. Rhodes' point, under 13, do I take it to read that there is no possibility until ecological reference points are available that the TAC could be over 2016 metric tons? I mean, I think both motions are saying that if you adopt either one, there is no possibility that a TAC would be set over 2016,000 metric tons until we get ERPs. Is that the way I would read this?
My reading is that motion 13 specifies that for 2018 and 2019, the tax shall be set at and shall not exceed 216,000 metric tons. That could be trumped if the Menhaden's, because it then says or, until, such time that Menhaden specific ecological reference points be available for management use. I take it therefore that it would be open in terms of what the specifications would be for 2020. It would require subsequent board action versus motion 12, which would enable that same metric, if you will, to continue forward beyond 2019. I don't see that, and maybe I'm misreading it, and if I am and I see Rachel's hand up, please clarify. So Rachel?
I think it should probably say or unless.
Do you want to urge that that be modified as such?
Please.
So let's see if there's any objection to modifying the substitute to replace until with the word until with the word unless. Is there any objection to making that amendment to the substitute motion? Seeing no objection, the substitute motion is so amended. Are there any other, particularly members of the board who have yet to speak on this issue who would like to before we call the question? There's been obviously a little bit of an added wrinkle, just noted. Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this point, we're splitting hairs, and in my case, I don't have the luxury of being able to do that all that much. So that's levity without Dr. Seuss, if you don't mind. I appreciate that. That's what we're doing. What I'd really like to see is take a 5-minute break, let the 4 people involved in these 2 motions figure out what they really want to say and get it over with, instead of spending the entire board's time trying to do the same thing, Mr. Chairman.
Dennis Abbott.
I've been sitting here when I was going to speak the last time, that I was interested in making a motion to limit debate, which would require a vote of the board. Because I think we've heard enough. Just like Eric just said, it's time to vote, and if the board is interested in voting, I think I'd like to make a motion to limit debate.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Lauren Lustig. Is there any objection to the motion to limit debate and vote on the question, the substitute motion? Seeing no objection, we will close debate and we will caucus for 30 seconds and then vote on the substitute motion. Okay, before I call the question, I believe Robert Boyles has a point of inquiry.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was asking ISF&P director and the executive director to clarify for me what staff's interpretation of the difference between the two. And my question specifically related to the question of binding future boards. And so I think if Tony had some comments I thought that help clarify it for me, that may help the board.
Tony Kearns?
So two things that Robert and I talked about, sort of the difference between these two motions. Under 13, the board would come back and revisit specifications after 2019, regardless of the progress of the ecological reference points. Under 12, you could continue on until perpetuity, I guess. And then under either motion, if the board wants to have a TAC that is different than 216 in future years, you would have to come back and do a 2/3 majority vote because you have set a TAC at 216. Even if it is less than 216 under motion 12, you still have to come back and have a 2/3 majority vote because you've set it at 216 in this motion. Under 13, you only have to do the 2/3 majority vote for 18 and 19 because you haven't set a TAC beyond that in motion 13.
Does that answer your question, Robert?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
We've ended debate. Are there any clarifying questions? Really, Lauren, I'm hesitant to go to you only because we really have closed debate, caucused, and we're really ready to vote. So I would take a question, but only on a point of order. Go ahead, Lauren.
Pennsylvania requests a roll call vote.
That's an appropriate request. We will have a roll call vote, and I will ask Megan to call the roll moving from north to south.
Maine.
Yes.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Massachusetts.
No.
Rhode Island.
No.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
No.
New Jersey.
Yes.
Pennsylvania.
No.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
Potomac River.
Yes.
Virginia.
Yes.
North Carolina.
Yes.
South Carolina.
No.
Georgia.
No.
Florida.
No.
NOAA Fisheries.
Yes.
Fish and Wildlife.
Yes.
The motion passes 11-7. The substitute becomes the main, and I'd like to think that we might be ready to take final action on this particular issue, and then perhaps have a break and take on the other issues. Unless anyone wanted to make any other motions to amend or substitute. I'm not encouraging that. I'm just making the offer. Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd make another motion to limit debate. I think we've had enough debate on this. It's time to vote.
Okay. Is there any objection to limiting debate and taking final action at this point? Seeing no objection, I appreciate the sentiment. I don't think we need to put that in the form of a motion. There's a unanimous consent on the part of the board to do that, so we will now do that. This will be the main motion. We will take a vote. Is there a request for a roll call?
It has to be its final action.
Oh, it has to be a roll call because this is final action on specifications. So, that said, we'll call the roll and we'll just stay with the flow and go north to south.
Maine.
Yes.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Massachusetts.
Yes.
Rhode Island.
No.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
Yes.
New Jersey.
Yes.
Pennsylvania.
No.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
Potomac River.
Yes.
Virginia.
Yes.
North Carolina.
Yes.
South Carolina,
Yes.
Georgia,
Yes.
Florida,
No.
NOAA Fisheries,
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Yes.
The motion passes 15-3, and we have dispensed with that agenda item, and we are now going to take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 10:04. Thank you. I'm going to call the meeting back to order. The next order of business is to continue forward with the other issues in the amendment, and moving in sequential order. The next would be quota allocation and timeframes. As set forth in the amendment, there are 6 options for allocation methods and 5 options for allocation timeframes, and the intent is to find a way to move on both, a sort of tier 1 approach combined with a tier 2 approach. So with that, is there anyone who would like to make a motion on the issue of quota allocation and timeframes? Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last night I'd indicated I had put together a bundle motion, and after thinking through it last night and after going through this morning, I've broken it apart, and I have sent Megan some language that needs to be tweaked just a little bit. She may have already tweaked it. I would move to choose the following options in Draft Amendment 3. Section 4.3.2, Allocation Method, Option C, with the jurisdictional allocation with a minimum base allocation of 0.75% fixed minimum for the quota time frame of 2012 to 2016. Section 4.3.3, quota transfer, Option A, quota transfer would be permitted. In Section 4.3.4, quota rollover, Option A, unused quota may not be rolled over. And I will end there, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Richie White. Moved by Pat Kelleher, seconded by Richie White, to do just what Pat read into the record and is now up on the screen. Is there discussion on the motion? Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer an amendment to that motion.
Go ahead.
Such that Section 4.3.2, Allocation Method, Option C, jurisdictional allocation with a minimum base allocation of a 1.0 fixed minimum.
Is there a second to that motion to amend? Seeing no, there is. Nicola Meserves moves to second the motion to amend. So moved and seconded to amend the main motion by changing what I understand to be the first part, and that is in lieu of a 0.75% fixed minimum, a 1% fixed minimum. And I'm sorry, I know Max is putting it up on the board, but Emerson, did you want to maintain the quota timeframe of 2012 through 2016?
Yes.
Thank you. So I think maybe we don't need that. I guess we're just modifying that one portion, therefore, of the first bullet in the main motion. Discussion on the motion to amend. Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually can support both motions, but we're back in the same issue, is that a 1% to me is cleaner because we don't have to, we essentially cover, I think, everybody's fishery in terms of both bait harvest and possibly episodic event. We go into a 0.75, then I would feel more comfortable, and I probably would argue later on that we go and have some episodic event, you know, because we're kind of pushing up against maybe some of the actual harvest going on right now. So it's another chicken and egg thing. I like 1% without episodic event. I like 0.75 with an episodic event. So.
Thank you. David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to follow up on Jim's point and point out a nuance of the linkage here with other issues. The percentages can be used by any state, regardless of what the percent is. The percent can be used by any state for catches in both state and federal waters. The episodic program can only be used for catches in state waters. Now, that sets up the dynamic where, and I'll use Rhode Island as an example of this so everybody understands it. The guy sitting immediately to my right had some of the vessels in Point Judith landing Menhaden from federal waters that were part of a herring catch. And if you have one program, you can land those, and if you have the other type of program, you can't land those. So there's this subtle distinction that a percent is, I think, more desirable from a coast-wide perspective as opposed to the episodic program. Thank you.
Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not opposed to the motion to amend. I think I would still argue for some sort of an episodic because of the potential for fish die-offs that we have within the state of Maine are real and have big economic impacts. I was trying to not look like I was going for too much of a fish grab here, to be honest, trying to be a little bit, have some recognition to both New Jersey and Virginia and also to the other jurisdictions to the south. So I can go either way, but I would want to see some sort of an episodic, and obviously I'll talk to that later.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My motion to amend does not preclude an episodic event. My motion does not relate to episodic events at all. That's another issue. But also, in terms of minimum allocation, states like New York, and there are other states as well, did not have a very good data collection system in place for bait fisheries, which includes Menhaden. There are other species as well. In New York, we weren't able to get a reporting system in place until just over the past few years. And now that we've got that reporting system in place, we realize that the fishery is more extensive and more robust than what was originally recorded or not recorded. So I think with, again, at least a 1%, we could even go for more, but 1% brings us to a place where we can cover our current fishery with a slight expansion. Additionally, in terms of public comment, we've heard a lot yesterday and today about public comment. I know that in New York, and I don't recall from Megan's presentation yesterday, public comment in other states, but there was significant public comment in support of states having at least a 1% fixed minimum. Thank you.
Thank you. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I struggle with this, but I'm going to oppose the amendment. When I originally talked about a 216,000 ton quota, I talked about compromise, and I talked about trying to meet everybody in the middle. My concern with the 1% is that it will not keep Virginia and New Jersey whole in this process. And I say that we don't have to keep Virginia and New Jersey whole. This is allocation. But I think in a compromise situation, I think it would be wise to. So I think the 3/4%, I believe we can make both those states whole. Combination of the quota they would get, and then added to that would be some chance at the unused allocation that would go into a pool from the states that would not be using their 3/4%. So based on that thinking, I'm going to oppose the 1% and stick with the original motion. Thank you.
Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I oppose the amendment, the 1%, also in opposition to the idea that having a combination, which was mentioned, of episodic event, which is about 4.8 million pounds, and then tacking on this 0.75, which is pretty close to about 58 million pounds. So they're definitely not linked in magnitude. I mean, a 1% episodic event is relatively small compared to providing a minimum, even at a 0.5%, to all the states. The problem is the way things stand now. If you look at 2012 through 2016, the best performance by the states that would be receiving the minimal, in addition to the 3 states that are already above 1%, is there would be a lot of unused quota. That might be okay for some states that wish to do that. We talked about opt-in, and opt-out. But, clearly, I don't want to call this a precedent because it's been around, but other than American eel, where certain states were provided 2,000 pounds that did not have previous landings, that was done in the quota building process, and the quota hasn't come due yet, but that was in a process taken by the ASMFC. Here we already have a quota system, and part of the situation is going to be a minimum, which we're not sure what will happen. Clearly, I'd rather substitute for this if you don't mind.
I'd prefer to vote first on the amendment and then entertain a motion to substitute.
I think that's fine, but please know that Virginia's opposed.
Other comments on the motion to amend? Is the board ready for the question? Is there a need to caucus? 30-second caucus. Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe a question for staff at the TAC at 216,000 metric tons. Just for my purposes, can you tell me what that equates to in pounds?
Megan's looking that up.
And what 1% equals, if you would, please, Megan.
So the total TAC in pounds is 476,198,486. And for 1%, give me one sec. It's like 4.76 million, roughly.
Okay, I'm going to call the question. All in favor of the motion to amend, please raise your hand. Hands down. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Hands down, thank you. Null votes, abstentions. We have 2 abstentions. The motion fails 6-10 with 2 abstentions. We're back to the main motion. Rob O'Reilly, did you want to offer a substitute?
Yes, and I'll have some brief remarks about it, but I would move to substitute option F under section 4.3.2 as the allocation method.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Dave Bush. Moved by Rob O'Reilly and seconded by Dave Bush to substitute what I understand to be is it your intent, Rob, to substitute the entire main motion with your substitute motion, or are you looking to just...
My understanding, it would just be at the top of the main motion with the allocation method, not the transfers and not the rollover.
Rob, there are 2 sub-options for option F. Do you want to include which sub-option you are interested in?
I was hoping that that would be discussed after this, because that has an importance of its own in terms of the allocation. So I think really what we're looking at in F is we have reached that situation with sub-option 1 where it would be a 50-50 distribution between bait and reduction, and sub-option 2 is 70% to bait, 30% reduction. The reason I'm hesitant to declare 1 is I think, just like Robert Boyles just did, I think it's important that we know the outcome of sub-option F in terms of what's going to be available. And I don't think anyone's working on their calculator fast enough to help me out on that. So we're looking at when 212,500 is exceeded, which was 216,000 it is, that's going to leave approximately another 212,500 is 468.4 million, and 216,000 metric tons is 476.1 million. So we're looking at about 8 million pounds. And I think in the sense of fairness, I think we ought to know that the board can say, well, that either does help my situation or it does not. So that's a really long response, Megan.
It's okay, and it does sound like that, if I understand how this would go, that if the board were to approve this amendment, there would then be a subsequent motion to clarify the particular sub-option associated with this.
That's correct.
Okay, I'll take comments both in favor and opposed. If you wish to speak in favor of this motion, please raise your hand. Question, John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Option F states that the time frame is 2009 to 2011, whereas the motion states the time frame is 2012 to 2016. Could Rob clarify which time frame he wants to use for option F?
I think Megan has a response.
Yeah, so the part up to the 212,500 metric tons, that's our current allocation method. So that is based on the 2009 to 2011. The part above, so the difference between 216 and 212,500 metric tons, I'm assuming that is what that 2012 to 2016 timeframe is applying to. So we can try and clarify that if you would like in the motion.
John?
Well, that's kind of confusing because under option F, the additional is just either divvied up between the bait and the reduction fisheries. It doesn't say anything about a time frame there. The base option F does specify a time frame, and it's not the time frame that is in the motion right now. So that's where we need some clarification.
Yeah, so what the amendment says is for the sub-options, depending on if it's a 50-50 or a 70-30 split, that distribution is, quote, based on landings during the time frame chosen in Tier 2, which is the time frame options. So that difference, and if we need to, I can pull up the picture that describes this option, because maybe that will help, but I'll look to Rob to see if he is looking to have that difference be based on the 2012 to 2016, and maybe if he is, we can clarify that in the motion.
Well, Megan, I'm just saying that it says at or below attack of 212,500, which is our base situation. The quota is allocated based on average landings from 2009, the current allocation method. Whereas this motion up here would imply that, no, we're not using that time frame, and it makes a big difference to states like ours which time frame is used.
John, this is my take on where we are. Rob's motion to substitute would replace all of the first bullet in the main motion. So that quota time frame 2012 to 2016 would not apply because it's not applicable to option F. So this is a motion to, and make sure it's correctly worded, to substitute option F under section 4.3.2, fully replacing the way the current main motion is proposed with regard to option C. And what Megan has been referring to is that we will, if this motion were to pass, we would necessarily have to come back and address the time frame issue associated with the delta between 212,500 and 216. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have that, but okay. It's just the way the motion is, I see. So the entire time frame is gone then from the original motion.
That's my interpretation. Rob, do I have that correct?
You do, and Megan had it right as well. So another decision would have to be made. If this passes, then we'll have to choose one of the sub options, and also the time frame is under Tier 2.
Okay, we have a few hands up. I guess I'll just try and just alternate back and forth without necessarily figuring out if it's pro or con. So I'll go next to Adam Nowalski.
So we have a motion to substitute, but if I'm clear on what you're saying, we're not substituting 18 for 16. We're only amending 16 to remove the first bullet point with the information contained in 18.
That's correct.
Okay, so that would probably best be clarified as an amendment to the original motion then.
I concur. So let's make it that. And thank you for that clarification. So motion to amend the first bullet in lieu of substituting for the entire motion. Thank you. So it is now a motion to amend, and it only refers to the first bullet under 16. And with that, further discussion on the motion to amend. Nicola Reserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't support the substitute motion. I don't feel that this option F meets one of the main objectives of this amendment document, which is to develop a management program which ensures fair and equitable access to the fishery for all regions and gear types. Given the tack that we've selected, this is going to redistribute a very small amount of quota to the other states and not meet the needs that we have identified. There's been some discussion that, well, we can use the episodic event program to address those needs still, but as pointed out, that doesn't provide for the state flexibility to manage that episodic amount as best fits the needs of the states. So I can't support the substitute and support the main motion. Thank you.
Additional, David Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the reasons why I supported this, and let me preface it with, it's no front page news that North Carolina has long had a reduction fishery until, of recent years when we decided that was the route we didn't want to pursue anymore. We would most certainly like to have more poundage than we have, at least enough to make it economically feasible to pursue a bait fishery. And we most certainly would love to do anything we can to get that without damaging those who depend on it on a regular basis. We won't pursue that bait fishery at the expense of communities that rely on it. We understand that different states have different fisheries that they're heavily reliant on. We all know that North Carolina has a big fishery that we're reliant on. So while we would pursue a bait fishery at almost all costs, we would not do so at the expense of other communities, other infrastructures, other states that have grown to rely on it due to the actions of this board. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat Kelleher?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo Nicole's comments. I'm having a real hard time with this being equitable. What I was trying to move forward in the original motion was some sort of balance between the jurisdictions. Maine caught over 4 million pounds alone, and if my rough last year and my rough estimates are this would split between jurisdictions just under 5 million. So if our math is right. So I've got very big problems with this motion, and I will be opposing it.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm also opposed to this amendment, and I agree with Pat and Nicola that this does not meet the goals of equitable distribution to states that don't have much quota.
Thank you. Any other comments on the motion to amend? Seeing none, is the board ready for the question? If so, do you need time to caucus? Let's give it a 15-second caucus just to make sure. Okay, looks like the board's ready. All in favor of the motion to amend, please raise your hand. Thank you. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. Any null votes? Any abstentions? We have 2. The motion fails 1 to 15 with 2 abstentions. We're back to the main motion. Is there any further discussion regarding the main motion? Seeing none, is the board ready to vote on the main motion, which has 3 parts? And there it is, up on the board. This would be a vote on all 3 parts: the allocation methodology, the year, the time frame, quota transfers, and quota rollovers. It would address all 3 components. If the board's ready for the question, I will call it. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Thank you. Opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. Any null votes? Any abstentions? We have 2. The motion passes 14 to 2 with 2 abstentions. We are moving along. And now up to, let me pause. There is a motion that was tabled. Is there any interest in bringing that back now or at any point? I guess that's a decision for the board. Adam Nowalski?
So I would move to bring that previous motion, take it from the table.
Is there a second to that motion to bring the tabled motion back? It is seconded by Emerson Hasbrook, moved by Adam Nowalski and seconded by Emerson Hasbrook, to bring back the tabled motion for consideration by the board. I forget whether this is even debatable or not, but let's just see if there's any objection to doing that. Seeing none, that motion is back before the board, and we'll wait for Max to try to catch up and see if we can get that back up on the screen. Okay, I think we have it up. And let's just make sure we've got it correct. I know there were a couple tweaks made to it. I assume this is the motion as it stood prior to when it was tabled earlier this morning. So it's back before the board. Discussion on this motion. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about process here. I generally support this motion. However, is the decision on states opting in or opting out, is that going to be brought back to the board for decision at our February meetings? Or is this going to be a staff decision or an administrative committee decision? How is that going to work?
Pat Kelleher?
The way it is crafted is that any quota that is not received by state is then redistributed to the other jurisdictions. So I see this as a staff effort to say this is where we are as far as what states have requested. It goes into a pot, and then that would be automatically redistributed.
Emerson Hasbrook?
Thank you. Yeah, follow up on that. I'm referring to the part that says that in terms of opting in, that the states which opt in must demonstrate that the state has the intent and ability to commercially harvest some or all of its Menhaden quota, et cetera, and how it can be demonstrated, et cetera. So I understand the part of it just going into a common pool, but who is going to make that determination as to whether or not the states have the ability to catch their allocation if they opt in?
Pat, do you want to speak to that?
I'll try, Mr. Chairman. I think the way I've envisioned it, maybe wrongly here, is that states would submit with their request what they have for regulations on the books associated with that fishery. If a jurisdiction didn't have regulations on the books associated with that fishery, then they wouldn't be able to request quota associated with it. That's, in concept, that's where I was trying to go.
Other questions, discussion, other discussion on the motion? John Clark.
Just further clarification, I guess, because you have the option to opt out of the program, but then you have to, so you can either opt out or opt in. You have to opt in, and if you do opt in, you have to prove you can catch what you're, I'm sorry if I'm repeating some of the things here, but it just seems a little contradictory here, these first two lines.
I'll leave that open unless somebody wants to grab onto it. Next, I have Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like this option. The last thing we just voted on prevents rollover, which I think is a good thing. But we're talking about a highly migratory species up and down the entire East Coast, and sometimes they're in some places and sometimes they aren't. And we're not allowing the rollover, yet the population might be healthy. And we have some jurisdictions that might not choose to prosecute this fishery, but we've determined that the resource is healthy, and some areas may be seeing a larger abundance. So to allow this to happen and go back into the general pool, I think is perfectly reasonable and a very healthy thing to do as far as the fishery goes.
Jim Gilmore.
Thanks, Chairman. So just to go back to Pat's comment, because it made me feel a lot more comfortable with this motion. So the bar would be if you have regulations in place to harvest, that would be the only requirement you would need. And if that's the case, I'm completely okay with this and support the motion.
Pat, do you want to say that on the record, please?
That's the intent.
So that could be clarified in the motion. It's up to the board to decide whether they want to try to perfect this, clarify it. But we've just had a good exchange regarding intent. Next, I have Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think roughly it looks like about 43 to 44 million pounds from the last motion on the 1% would be allocated, and clearly that exceeds the capacity that we think we know around the table. So my question is, the last motion also talked about the transferability, and I'm wondering how that coupling works with the opt-in situation, opt-out. So for example, a state which comes first? Or are they coupled together? A state may choose to opt out, and then does the state have the ability to transfer right after that?
Pat Kelleher?
So there's probably 100 different what-ifs here, but again, the intent, jurisdiction opts in. They don't have fish within their state waters. They're not harvesting those fish. They end up with a surplus at the end of the year. The ability is for another state could request a transfer to help with any overage that might have happened within their jurisdiction. So I'm trying to create some certainty up front for states that will promulgate fisheries, and the flexibility on the back end in case they go over what their targets are.
Russ Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few problems with this motion, and one of those hits really hard at New Jersey because we already have two species where we have quota that we do not use. One is striped bass, where we have a commercial quota, and we have a recreational, as everybody knows, a recreational program that allows some of that harvest, but we do not reach the total harvest. And the other is horseshoe crabs, where we have a quota that we do not use. And I would really have a hard time if this passed trying to defend how we don't use that horseshoe crab quota on a different, so because it's really hard for me to even think about this. And I can feel for Pennsylvania on that one, where they're trying to be conservative, and this doesn't let them do that.
Senator Minor.
I'm trying to get I guess a feel for the sentence that says any quota that's not received by a state would then be redistributed. And so is it the intent here that that redistribution could occur either at the front end or in the back end of that given year? So it either could be used to cover overages of another jurisdiction, or it could be used in the pool on the front end to theoretically increase the quota that states might get that are still in the fishery.
Pat Kelleher.
The intent is for it to be redistributed on the front end. The ability within the last motion spoke to the ability to transfer. That would be on the back end of the fisheries.
Thank you.
Dr. Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a couple things, I guess. I apologize that on the previous motion, I just wanted to clarify for the record that, our vote was based on the time frame, not necessarily the method that was used. That time frame is not really good for North Carolina, but it is what it is. And so I'm still struggling with the ability to demonstrating intent and ability to commercially harvest some or all of that quota. And I guess I'm concerned about, if there are years where, due to whatever, we're in the hurricane belt, that impacts a lot of our fisheries pretty significantly. And if folks don't have the opportunity to get out there, that it would impact our ability to opt in to our full allocation. I'm still struggling a little bit with that part of the decision-making process. I absolutely appreciate what Pat's trying to do here. Just trying to wrap my head around it. Thank you.
And I'll just say my understanding of the way this motion reads is that there are three ways that you could demonstrate your intent and ability. One would be the issuance of permits for applicable gear types or species. The other would be via historic landings. The other would be the abundance of menhaden in state and or federal waters. As I read this motion literally, those are the three standards that would be applied to a state's request. Dr. Duval.
So follow up. So, right now, the time frames for harvest that we're using in this amendment did not allow states and jurisdictions that previously had reduction fisheries to be able to, those landings were not included in those historic time frames. So are we going to be allowed to, use that as demonstration of availability of menhaden in our waters?
I guess I have my interpretation, but I'd rather look to the maker of the motion as to what your intent is with regard to historic landings and how that should be applied.
to the literal sense, historic landings. I was trying to be inclusive as we developed this and trying to give some flexibility. So it's any one or combination of those three criteria. And in my mind, Maine had a reduction fishery at one time. That would come into play here if we were in the situation to want to consider this, the use of this.
And I'll just challenge you if you don't mind. Does historic, in your opinion, mean any time prior to or at some fixed time prior to or during some fixed time frame prior to?
In my mind, it's any time prior to.
So that clarifies the intent. Andy Shields.
So we're in a unique position, and I really appreciate Russ Allen mentioning that. So this really looks extremely complicated for something that could be very simple. The question I have is almost an objective observer is what is the need for all the language? We just said what the quotas, what the distribution is going to be, 0.75%. You take the total amount, somebody already calculated it, what each state should have. You divide that up, and that's what the state's quota is, and you're done. There doesn't seem to be a need for a state to determine now or at the beginning of a year whether they're going to be in or out of the fishery. If they decide, if 2 or 3 states decide to hold their quota for whatever reason, maybe because the environmental activists and encouragers and the recreational fishermen say to that state, we really don't want you to catch that full quota. We know it's available, but we'd like to meet with you, and we think maybe you should only take 50% of the quota that's due you because it's affecting our local waters. So that option would exist if you don't have all this language. This seems to me it's almost like a states' rights issue that the states now are going to give up their authority to make a decision how they want to spend their marbles. We were all given 200,000 marbles or 212,000 marbles, metric tons of marbles yesterday. Today we're given 216,000 metric tons of marbles. New Hampshire might decide to keep all of their marbles, or they might decide to give some of their marbles away. That should be their right. And I don't think should be predetermined at the beginning. So let the states decide how they want to spend their marbles. Thank you very much.
Robert Boyles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm struggling with this. You know, we've just made, if this amendment passes, if the whole amendment passes, we have just allocated 3.5 million pounds. Y'all have given me 3.5 million pounds, Palmetto State 3.5 million pounds of Menhaden, that we have, we don't have those fisheries developed. And I think that's clearly a policy call. That's a motion that passed, and if the amendment passes, that will will be our operating stance. I appreciate the intent of the motion. You know, as someone, as one of the states with really not a dog in this fight, and I appreciate the intent of the motion to perhaps soften the blow or to ease the impact of the entire amendment, whatever we pass here today. At the same time, I struggle with the whole idea, and I should have prefaced this at the beginning, it is my full intent that we will have biological ecological reference points which will first determine how many fish we're going to leave in the water. This is, I think I've described to a number of you, at its essence, an allocation amendment. The first order question is how much to leave in the water. I think we've committed to that through our actions yesterday and today and through the intent of the amendment. And so once we've determined what that level of ecosystem services is, then the real question is how are we going to split this pie that we've, the portion of the pie that we take out of the oven to eat. And I struggle, you know, South Carolina is just has no capacity for 3.5 million pounds of Menhaden at 0.75%. I'm certainly willing to play ball for the good of the cause in implementing this policy of managing these species as a reference, for ecological services, as well as supporting a bait and a reduction fishery. But I struggle with this. I don't know that the commission, and I look to staff, is this precedent setting in terms of giving a state a share of the pie that we have absolutely no intention of using. And that's another policy call that I'm just struggling with. So I've enjoyed the conversation. Let me rephrase that. I'm learning a lot through the conversation, and we'll continue to grapple with it. Thank you.
And I do know you asked a question. We'll see if we can get a staff response to that. But I'll next go to Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this, and I'll give you the example of how this will affect New Hampshire and how I see this working. Presently, we have negligible landings. We also have a large purse seine vessel that lands millions of pounds of herring in New Hampshire annually. This year, they talked about landing mixed loads of herring and Menhaden. Didn't happen this year. They also talked about additional availability of Menhaden showing up, and they may want to land total loads of Menhaden. And they come in at 400,000 pounds a trip. So this would allow us to, we would opt in, and I'm just guessing, maybe 1.5 million pounds. Put the balance right out of the gate into the pool and see how it went for a few years. And maybe we would opt out of all of it in the future if that vessel stopped landing in New Hampshire. But this gives the flexibility of us not being in a position where we'd have to lock a fishery out, having no quota that we presently have. And I think that's a fairness issue. I also support this because I think this is the compromise originally in the 216,000 metric tons that I was talking about. This gives each state a chance at a fishery, and this fishery is changing, so we need some ability for states that haven't been fishing in recent times to have a chance to fish now. But it also puts back into the pool the fish that aren't used, and that gives the ability to try to make some states whole that may not be whole with the use of the 0.75% going to the new states. So I think that's the compromise. This balances it. And I understand the angst of Pennsylvania. New Hampshire doesn't use their small commercial striped bass quota either. But I think looking at this in its entirety and thinking about it in a compromise situation and how, without doing it this way, maybe the 220,000 metric tons was a fairer target. So that was my thinking in this whole process, starting with the 216. So I hope the states will consider, that approach to this and support it.
Thank you. Tony Kearns, could you take a crack at answering Robert Boyle's question, which, as I understood it, was whether there's any precedent for an approach like this with regard to any other FMP that involves state-by-state allocation? And Robert's involved in a sidebar right now, so maybe we hold on that, Tony. I'll come back to you because I want to make sure Robert's focused. Adam Nowalski, you're next.
Thank you very much. I see this motion as having two relevant parts that we're discussing. One is the element of opting out and being able to redistribute that to states that may need or want it. The second element of this is this opt-in provision which forces states, in my opinion, to demonstrate the intent to use their quota, and if not, a sense that would be taken from them without their consent. And that gives me trouble. And I hear that concern from some other members around the board here as well, both in terms of how it might impact other species, precedent setting, etc. I'm going to make a motion to substitute, Mr. Chairman. I believe it's going to include a number of these terms, so maybe staff just wants to start with cut and pasting, and I'll go along here with it. My motion to substitute is, at the start of each fishing year and no later than January 31st, States may declare if they want to opt out of the fixed minimum program. States, do you want me to just read the whole thing or just let staff go along with me and read as it comes up on the board?
Put it in red. Adam, tell him to put it in red.
Adam, do you have it on a piece of paper or no?
I can come up there and give it to you if you'd like.
If you can read it into the record, and then if you could just come up and help us get it up on the screen.
Okay, that'd be fine. At the start of each fishing year and no later than January 31st, states may declare if they want to opt out of the fixed minimum program. States may declare if they have the option and decline their fixed minimum allocation or maintain 10,000 pounds for bycatch purposes and decline the remainder of the quota. If a jurisdiction declines its full allocation, it must identify the amount they do not wish to receive. Any quota that is not received by a state is redistributed to the other jurisdictions based on historic landings from the time period selected. So essentially what I'm doing is removing the requirements for opting in and focusing on opt-out entirely.
Let's do this. The board will be at ease for 5 minutes as we get that motion up on the board. And
I think if you'd like to, I think a lot of people want to take the break, but it's pretty darn close with what's up.
well, we'll take a 5-minute break just to get this motion up, and then we'll pick up right where we left off, starting with, is there a second to the motion? Thank you. I'd like to resume, and I'd like to go back to Adam to first ensure that the motion he has up is accurate in terms of what he intends. Then I'm going to see if there is a second. Then I'm going to allow Adam to speak to it, and then I'm going to allow, well, depending on, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just stop right there. So, Adam, is this the motion that you would like to make? The wording that, with regard to the wording that's up on the board right now?
With a nod of great thanks to staff, yes, it is. Would you like me to reread it at this point?
Please do.
Move to substitute that at the start of each fishing year and no later than January 31st, states may declare if they want to opt out of the fixed minimum program. States may declare to opt out of the program and decline their fixed minimum allocation or maintain 10,000 pounds for bycatch purposes and decline the remainder of their quota. If a jurisdiction declines its full allocation, it must specifically identify the amount they do not wish to receive. Any quota that is not received by a state is redistributed to the other jurisdictions based on historic landings from the time period selected by the board in this amendment.
Is there a second to that motion? Dr. Duvall seconds the motion. So the motion has been made and seconded. And Adam, I'll go to you first to have you speak to it, and then I have some thoughts about some public input on this. Adam?
So thank you. So first let me identify what is different about this with regards to what already exists in the draft amendment, the specific language with option C. This includes more specificity in two areas. One, it provides the specificity of the date by which this declaration needs to occur. And two, it provides the specificity of what would happen to that quota that is not utilized by individual states. The draft amendment is silent on what occurs right now. This specifically lays that out through the last sentence. This issue of fixed minimum is a bit of a difficult one, because essentially what we're doing is taking fish that states have had historical allocations of, historical use, and saying we're making a unilateral decision to hand it out, essentially. That's a tough pill. And if it is the intent of the board, as the original motion did, to force states to prove that they can use those fish, then I would say that that whole fixed minimum approach is flawed, and that we as a board should go back and reconsider it. But if that is in fact the decision that we're making, that we're going to go down that road, then to go ahead and put the requirement on those states to say, and oh, by the way, even though we decided to give it to you, if you can't show we're going to use it, we're going to take it back, that's even more flawed, and I can't support that. And that's my justification for this motion to substitute.
Thank you for that. And because both this substitute motion and the main motion, which address the issue of, we'll call it opt-in and versus opt-out, lend a lot of specificity to the provisions that were not, with regard to the provision that was only set forth in the amendment in general terms. I'm going to allow some public input on this, but it really needs to be specific to the issue before the board right now on opt-in versus opt-out. Is there anyone from the public who would like to address the board on either the main or substitute motion? I see two hands, and I'll go first to the gentleman approaching the mic. Thank you. Could you please introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Monty Dale from Omega Protein. If my math is correct, doing it on my phone in the back, I just witnessed the board vote for about an 8% increase in the overall TAC because of the health of the stock and how well it's doing. And in fact, some argued that it could have been raised much more. But based on this motion, again, we could probably ask staff for clarification. It essentially means about an 8 to 10% reduction for Virginia in Virginia's harvest from this year. For me, that's laying off a lot of people from work. It even means now I have assets that I no longer need. So should I go to a state who I've heard around the table saying they want to grow an industry, they want to build an industry, do I now need to go and try to sell vessels, sell equipment, and even maybe barter labor to those states to grow something on the backs of people who have been doing this like mine for 5 generations? I can't even believe what I hear. I honestly can't. It also completely changes the mix, the supply and demand mix. I'm not in the bait market, but it completely changes the supply and demand mix for bait, because you're now taking fish that had been used for reduction and not on the bait market, and you're moving millions and millions of pounds of those into the bait market. And you have industries, bait industries, who've built, again, for many, many generations to build up a business. And now they're going to compete in a flooded bait market. I don't know if that's even being considered here, but I just wanted to point that out. And, from a Virginia standpoint, from a taxpayer in Virginia's standpoint, and from a very large employer who represents an awful lot of people, this is not going in a very good direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to address the board? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeff Reichel from Lund's Fisheries. Yeah, I'd like to echo a lot of what Monty just said, and just say that, what I've seen happen today has totally destroyed what I understand fishery management to be. For the most part, fisheries have always been managed and allocated based on history and recency, and that was completely thrown out the window today. There's a couple states that have history, recent history, and history going way back. And what you've basically done today is done a total reallocation to other states. So, I mean, if that stands, then I do not agree with this amendment. I think I agree with the original motion so that we have the opportunity to get some of the quota that's been taken from us for no good reason back. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir, in the back. If there's anyone else who would like to speak, please come forward and be ready to take the microphone. I don't see any other hands up, but I just want to move on after this. Thank you.
Jimmy Kellum from Virginia. My company's Kellum Maritime. We fish for bait and for reduction and sell to Omega. I appreciate what Adam's trying to do here, but this doesn't fix the fact that we just transferred 301,000 bushels from reduction to bait. Do you have an idea what that's going to do to the bait industry? The bait industry will collapse based on what we've done in the last hour. So this doesn't fix what we've done. We need to go backwards and say we've made a serious mistake here, because we have made a mistake. We have pillaged New Jersey and Virginia on the theory that some other states may establish a bait business. I'm on the AP committee, and they'll tell you I was all in favor of the 4 states getting more quota, but not to this degree. We need to rethink this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. One last comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is A.J. Erskine. I'm with the Mid-Atlantic Bait in Virginia. I agree with the previous comments. I disagree with this amendment. I think we did make a mistake with the fixed minimum. We're talking about economically changing the bait market drastically, so we're opposed.
Thank you. So now I'd like to go back to the board for comments on this motion to substitute. I had 4 names that were waiting, that were already in queue, and I'm just going to go right through those to see if they'd like to speak on the substitute motion, starting with Cherie Patterson.
Richie covered what I was going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleen Giannini.
I was looking for just some confirmation on Pat's original motion that a state's decision to opt in and then subsequent declaration for the amount of quota it would like in that year wouldn't be affected in subsequent years?
Pat Kelleher?
Correct. It would be an annual decision by the state.
Okay, and then just a quick follow-up, I guess just a comment on this. I think that this motion here that Adam has up, I think it could be maybe a lot simpler, and I don't know if it would work better, just to simply end that states may declare to opt out of the program and decline their fixed minimum allocation, and not necessarily have to have a 10,000 pound for bycatch purpose in there.
Duly noted. Next I have Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly the speakers from the public. I certainly echo what they have to say from Virginia. I do think that there was a mistake earlier on, and it's too late in one way. The 220,000 metric tons would have solved some of these problems, and we could have gotten away from the fixed minimum that I've talked about a couple of times as to what the ramifications and repercussions will be from that. I don't really think that making a situation like this more palatable is something that we should avoid. I think we should try and do that. I've been hearing making certain states whole, although, and I don't take any offense at all, I did hear Richie White say, but maybe we don't have to make them whole. But, clearly we need to be a little more careful about what we're doing. I see what's up on the board, and no disrespect to Pat or to Adam. I see it as a contrivance. I see it as an outfall of having not thought through some of the decisions that we made. And I can't support it, and I regret that we didn't make some earlier decisions that maybe wouldn't get us in this place. If I look across the table at New Jersey, I see their workforce diminishing. If I think of Virginia, our workforce diminishing. I mean, how many things can we add on to our lives in the states that we have to monitor and, keep sacred when we don't need to start doing that? And we shouldn't have started doing this on this situation. It was fixable earlier on. Thank you.
Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I prefer the initial motion to this substitute. The purpose of the reallocation option that we selected was to meet the needs of more states for their commercial fisheries, and allocating £3.5 million to a state without a fishery runs counter to that objective. And so for consistency purposes, I think we need to look at that objective when it comes to this motion as well. The ASMSC does have a long-held practice, I guess I would call it, of allowing states to be more conservative than the requirements. But I don't think that that has normally come at the disadvantage to other states, and that's what the initial motion was trying to address in some part. So I don't support the substitute. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony Kearns, did you have something you wanted to add?
Just for clarification, so the first two sentences are sort of in opposition of each other here in the motion, because the first one says you can declare to opt out and decline all of your allocation or maintain just the 10,000 pounds. But then the second sentence says if a jurisdiction declines its full amount, it must specify the amount that they don't wish to receive. So I think if a state wanted to keep part of the allocation, you could just say states may declare to opt out of the program and decline all or part of their fixed minimum, instead of restricting it to just being able to keep 10,000 pounds. Does that make sense, Adam? See where I'm thinking the two sentences may go against each other?
I do believe I see your point, Adam. Do you want to speak to that?
So your suggestion would be to remove the or maintain 10,000 pounds through the period?
Yeah, if that's the intention, yes, but also say decline all or part of your fixed minimum. So it allows the state to determine what is being declined. If they want to keep half, then they could still keep half. If they don't, if that's what your intention was here.
My intention is definitely to allow states to choose the portion they wish to decline. So I'll leave it up to the discretion of staff and the chair whether having that information on the record is sufficient, or if they have wordsmithing they'd like to offer.
I believe staff is undertaking wordsmithing. Let's see if we can get it to a point that would comport with your intent, Adam.
I have no objection to how it's been being modified pending the final result.
So let's read back into the record where this motion now stands as amended. Move to substitute that at the start of each fishing year and no later than January 31st, states may declare if they want to opt out of the fixed minimum program. States may declare to opt out of the program and decline all or part of their fixed minimum allocation. If a jurisdiction declines part of their allocation, it must specifically identify the amount they do not wish to receive. Any quota that is not received by a state is redistributed to the other jurisdictions based on historic landings from the time period selected by the board in this amendment. Adam, does that meet with your intent?
Yes, thank you.
Is there any objection from the board to modifying the motion as now written? Seeing no objection, that change has been accepted and the motion stands as it does. Further discussion on the motion. Doug Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to get my arms around this motion versus the prior motion, and I guess I'll direct a question to maybe Robert Boyles in the case of maybe South Carolina. The language in the prior motion dealing with the intent and the ability to demonstrate that you can harvest your quota that's allocated. If that one passed, South Carolina has no, I mean, there are states that have nothing in their regulations that allow them to do that. Obviously, they could pass things. Would by default South Carolina automatically give up their quota because they don't have anything in place to show intent or ability to harvest? Under this motion, all the states can, for whatever reasons, just say we're not going to opt out. We're just not going to opt out, and therefore we'll keep our quota to do whatever we want to with it. Under the prior motion, some states that don't have a fishery at the present, by default, would not get their quota. Do you understand what I'm trying to? And so I think from what was said at the public comment, the concern may be that under this provision, it's just so easy to take quota that's not going to be utilized or negotiated in other ways, but it penalizes potentially severely the states that are getting less of a quota by what we're doing, by the 75 or the 3/4%. But Robert, I just ask you that. Did you read the first motion to say by default that if that one passed, that South Carolina would not get any quota? Do you follow my question?
Robert, it's your call as to whether you feel like you want to respond to that or not.
I think that, you know, what our particular situation is, to answer Doug's question, is that the gear that would process menhaden is unlawful in South Carolina, outlawed by the legislature years ago. Nothing to say that a processor couldn't fish federal waters if the fish were there, for instance. We don't have the processing capacity necessarily. Not to say that it couldn't develop. So, Doug, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of where we are in South Carolina.
Let's leave that one there for now and circle back if need be. Lauren Lustig.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. With my newfound skills for wordsmithing, I would like to thank Richie White for reminding us of the benefits of compromise. If we dig in our heels, there's going to be plenty of blood on the floor all around the table. So I'm in favor of compromise. And the gentleman who just spoke from Lund Fisheries reminded us of the importance of history. I was a history major in college. I understand history. So if I was to choose a historic date to hearken back to, it would be the famous voyage of Captain John Smith in the Chesapeake. All right, that's the date I'd like to use as a baseline. Thank you.
Senator Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the word may says to me that we may not need any of this language at all, either in the original motion, which would be 18 or 19. What this does, in my view, is changes an allocation from currency, which it is under the original, what's been passed so far, 216 million metric tons, to a non-currency, because it automatically goes back to the board for reallocation. And so from a states' rights perspective, it seems to me that I would want Connecticut to have this allocation as a currency. It may very well be that we could choose to transfer it, but my read of this is that by making the declaration to opt out of the program, we devalue that currency. It automatically goes back into the pool. And so I don't know what state would actually do that. And therefore, that goes to my question of why do we even need either one of these? I understand the original intent of the original motion, which was try to set that base number as low as possible and create a feeling that for those states that were harmed in this redistribution process, there was some mechanism to get it back. But I would suggest that the state of Connecticut could still enter into an agreement with the state of Virginia or the state of New Jersey to redistribute our allocation in the form of currency back to one of those states should we choose to do it without either of these motions. So I'm probably inclined not to support either one of them.
Thank you. And I think it's a very good time to remind the board that the amendment right now has a specific provision addressing this issue, which would be changed by either of these motions. So if, let's just say for the sake of discussion, neither of these motions passed, the default would be the following. Should a jurisdiction desire to forego the fixed minimum quota it has been allocated, it may, on an annual basis, choose to decline its quota completely or maintain 10,000 pounds for bycatch purposes and decline the remainder of the quota. Quota which is relinquished by the states will be redistributed to the other jurisdictions. Should a state choose to relinquish its annual quota, the Commission must be notified through the annual compliance report process. I just want to make it clear that that is what the amendment currently says with regard to the allocation method that's already been adopted. These motions seek to tweak that, change that, modify it. Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want some clarification. Mr. Kelleher's original motion had two other portions in it. Are those two other portions still in play in this?
I'm going to have Megan answer it.
I don't believe so, but I would look to the maker of the motion to clarify that.
Pat Kelleher?
Because this is a motion to substitute, I don't believe that would be the case. I think this would completely replace my motion.
So we have that now on the record. David Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to go back to the point that you made about the language in the document and just remind everybody of what Richie White pointed out, and I thought it was a good example of how the mechanism would work. If the state of New Hampshire has a herring fishery that's taking place and they need, for the sake of argument, 400,000 pounds of menhaden in order to eliminate the bycatch and regulatory discards, they would have the option of selecting 400,000 pounds. I don't think the state of New Hampshire wants to have a directed fishery. I don't think they necessarily, and this is my read, but they would like the opportunity to select a number above 10,000 pounds so that they could eliminate bycatch. And I just remind everybody of that. This system doesn't work very well when we promote regulatory discards. So I think there's a lot of merit in what Richie said before. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the motion to substitute? David Bush and then Dr. Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad you let me go first because I can never follow her. She's a tough act, right? So I'm still wading through this, and there's a lot of different things that could happen from this. Now, in my mind, and it may be different for some folks, but we've achieved our conservatory effect by the overall tack that we put into place. What the original motion in my mind would do, although the dates is something that I would question, would be to make states actively pursue their catch, and if they are not going to or can't demonstrate that they can, then that puts it back into play for everybody else. That doesn't mean that, say, North Carolina is going to come up the Potomac River and start fishing for menhaden. But the overall quota itself has already accounted for the conservatory hopes that we want to achieve here. So again, I'm sort of trying to walk my way through this. And in my mind, I would think that maybe the first motion would be something to maybe take a little bit of the sting out of the initial cut that we already had. Now, again, I'm sure I'll learn more before we get done here, but thank you.
Dr. Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I seconded the motion for purposes of discussion. I think it's been very robust, and I really appreciate the public comment, and I appreciate what Adam was trying to do, and in terms of, I guess, providing some assurance to states. But I also hear that the previous motion would actually would actually provide more assurance of making certain that the quota that is available to those areas that actually need it. So I appreciate what Adam was going to try to do, but I think I'm actually not going to support the substitute motion based on the public comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And I echo the comment just made that we've had a robust discussion, and I'm going to take that as a cue to call the question. So with that, 30-second caucus, and then we'll vote on the motion to substitute. Okay, I'm going to call the question. All in favor of the motion to substitute, please raise your hand. Hands down. All opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. Any null votes? Any abstentions? There are 2. Motion fails 2-14 with 2 abstentions. So we're back to the main motion, and if after Max catches up, we'll put that back up on the board. Any further discussion on this main motion? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry to keep coming back to it, but the intent of this is to put it on the states that this fixed minimum is much more than most states will use. So a state would have to actually state early in the year that they are going to use what they get, and if not, it automatically goes back into the pool to be redistributed. And obviously, from the concerns that were brought up by the public, this would have to be done in a very timely manner. Do we need to have more details in this motion, or do we need to further specify how we are going to reallocate unused fixed minimum quota from these states?
I think the motion is quite detailed and quite clear on that, but I'll look to other board members to see if they feel a need for additional clarity. David Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To John's question, it might read as slightly different here, and I think it's pretty explicit in the motion. If Delaware didn't need their full allocation, they could request any amount up to the full allocation, but that's up to the state of Delaware.
I get that, Dave. I'm just saying the fact is I could, for whatever reason, say I want the full 0.75% of the quota and not get anywhere near that, and then it doesn't get reallocated. So to me, that's a real problem, because we have enough quota that's being taken from Virginia and New Jersey that if enough states did what I just said, that reallocation wouldn't happen in a timely enough manner to help those fisheries catch. And as with many states, we're dependent on those states to provide bait for our crab fishery and for other fisheries. So this is a big question, is how this is going to work.
Dr. Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think to John's point, the motion that we passed previously included the transfer provision. So I think I would look to that to ensure that that quota is available to be used. I mean, I know that, North Carolina this past year was approached by several states earlier, actually pretty early in the year, to see if we might be able to transfer some of our quota to them to alleviate the issue of an abundance of menhaden that they were encountering off their waters. So I would hope that that transfer provision would be utilized in that situation.
Well, transfers are voluntary. All I'm saying is I'm just giving a worst case scenario here, is that a state could take the minimum, not transfer it, and we'd have problems in the fisheries. So that's the only reason I wanted to see more specific language.
Good exchange. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, is the board ready? Does the board need time to caucus? David Borden, 1 minute caucus? Yeah, 1 minute caucus, and then we'll vote on this main motion. Okay, is the board ready for the question? I see some caucusing still going on. Now it looks like it's ending. Okay, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Thank you. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. Null votes? Abstentions? 2. Robert.
Mr. Chairman, a motion to recess, please.
Well, first we need to clarify the vote because I think we may have missed one. So I'm going to ask for a recount because I think our math came out wrong here. So let's make sure we get this right. Those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand and keep them up. Thank you. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. Final vote. The motion fails 7-9 with 2 abstentions. The request to recess could be coupled with a lunch break. Are we at that point, Robert, or were you looking for something shorter term?
That was my intent. Yes, sir.
Let's break for lunch. And Tony, what time do we want to reconvene? Or Bob?
Let's do 1 o'clock.
Let's reconvene at 1 p.m., please.
We will reconvene at 1 p.m. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
It's not going to be an enjoyable lunch.